Welcome to Voice of the Pages, where the echoes of history and economics come to life. Today, we present Section 4 of one of the most provocative works ever written, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve by G. Edward Griffin. Section 4. A Tale of Three Banks. It has been said that those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. It may come as a surprise to learn that the Federal Reserve System is America's fourth central bank, not its first. We have been through all this before, and each time the result has been the same. Interested in what happened? Then let's set the coordinates of our time machine to the colony of Massachusetts in the year 1690. To activate, turn the page. Chapter 15. The Lost Treasure Map. The bitter experience of the American colonies with fiat money. The resolve of the Founding Fathers to prohibit the new nation from resorting to paper money without backing. The drafting of the Constitution to that end. The creation of a true American dollar. The prosperity that followed. In the golden days of radio, on the Edgar Bergen show, the ventriloquist would ask his dummy, Mortimer Snerd, "How can you be so stupid?" And the answer was always the same. After a moment of deep thought on the part of Mortimer, he would drawl his reply, "Well, it ain't easy." When we look at the monetary chaos around us today, the evaporating value of the dollar and the collapsing financial institutions, we are compelled to ask, how did we get into this fix? And, unfortunately, Mortimer's response would be quite appropriate. To find out how we got to where we are, it will be necessary to know where we started, and a good place to begin that inquiry is with the Constitution of the United States. Article 1, Sections 8 and 10 say, Congress shall have the power to borrow money, to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures, and to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting. No state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, or make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. The delegates were precise in their use of these words. Congress was given the power to coin money, not to print it. Thomas M. Cooley's Principles of Constitutional Law explains that to coin money is to stamp pieces of metal for use as a medium of exchange and commerce, according to fixed standards of value. What was prohibited was to emit bills of credit, which, according to the speeches and writings of those who drafted the document, meant the printing of paper IOUs which were intended to be circulated as money. In other words, the printing of fiat money not backed by gold or silver. At first, it would seem that nothing could be more clear. Yet, these two simple clauses have become the basis for literally thousands of pages of conflicting interpretation. The crux of the problem is that, while the Constitution clearly prohibits the states from issuing fiat money, it does not specifically prevent the federal government from doing so. That was truly an unfortunate oversight on the part of the document's framers. But they probably never dreamed in their wildest nightmares that their descendants could be so stupid as to not understand their intent. Furthermore, it ain't easy to miss their intent. All one has to do is look at the monetary history that led up to the Constitutional Convention and to read the published letters and debates of the men who affixed their signatures to that founding document. As one reads through the debates on the floor of the convention, one is struck by the passion that these delegates held on the subject of money. Every one of them could remember from his personal experience the utter chaos in the colonies caused by the issuance of fiat money. They spoke out against it in no uncertain terms, and they were adamant that it should never be tolerated again in America at either the state or federal level. Paper money in the colonies. The first colonial experience with fiat money was in the period from 1690 to 1764. Massachusetts was the first to use it as a means of financing its military raids against the French colony in Quebec. The other colonies were quick to follow suit, and within a few years, were engaging in a virtual orgy of printing bills of credit. There was no central bank involved. The process was simple and direct, as was the reasoning behind it. As one colonial legislator explained it, "Do you think, gentlemen, that I will consent to load my constituents with taxes when we can send to our printer and get a wagon load of money, one quire of which will pay for the whole?" The consequences of this enlightened statesmanship were classic. Prices skyrocketed, Legal tender laws were enacted to force the colonists to accept the worthless paper, and the common man endured great personal losses and hardship. By the late 1750s, Connecticut had price inflated by 800%. The Carolinas had inflated 900%, Massachusetts 1,000%, Rhode Island 2,300%. The situation was so out of hand that, beginning in 1751, the British Parliament stepped in and, in one of those rare instances where interference from the mother country actually benefited the colonies, it forced them to cease the production of fiat money. Henceforth, the Bank of England would be the only source. What followed was unforeseen by the promoters of fiat money. Amid great gloom about insufficient money, a miracle boom of prosperity occurred. The forced use of fiat money had compelled everyone to hoard their real money and use the worthless paper instead. Now that the paper was in disgrace, the colonists began to use their English and French and Dutch gold coins once again. Prices rapidly adjusted to reality, and commerce returned to a solid footing. It remained so even during the economic strain of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and during the period immediately prior to the Revolution. Here was a perfect example of how an economic system in distress can recover if government does not interfere with the healing process. Wartime inflation. But all of this came to a halt with the onset of colonial rebellion. Not only did open hostilities throw England deeper into the cogs and wheels of the central bank mechanism, it also was the compelling motive for the colonies to return to their printing presses. The following figures speak eloquently for themselves. At the beginning of the war, in 1775, the total money supply for the federated colonies stood at $12 million. In June of that year, the Continental Congress issued another $2 million. Before the notes were printed, another $1 million was authorized. By the end of the year, another $3 million. $19 million in 1776. $13 million in 1777. $64 million in 1778. $125 million in 1779. A total of $227 million in 5 years on top of a base of $12 million is an increase of about 2,000%. On top of this federal money, the states were doing the same in an approximately equal amount. And still more. The Continental Army, unable to get enough money from Congress, issued certificates for the purchase of supplies totaling $200 million. $650 million created in 5 years on top of a base of $12 million is an expansion of the money supply of over 5,000%. Although the economy was devastated by this flood of fiat money, most victims were totally unaware of the cause. In 1777, the sentiment of a large segment of the population was expressed by the words of one patriotic old lady who said, "What a shame it is that Congress should let the poor soldiers suffer when they have power to make just as much money as they choose." The immediate result of this money infusion was the appearance of prosperity. After all, everyone had more money, and that was perceived as a very good thing. But this was quickly followed by inflation as the self-destruct mechanism began to roll. In 1775, the colonial monetary unit, called the Continental, was valued at $1 in gold. In 1778, it was exchanged for 25 cents. By 1779, just 4 years from its issue, it was worth less than a penny and ceased to circulate as money at all. It was in that year that George Washington wrote, "A wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions." The saying, "not worth a continental," has its origin in this gloomy period. The true nature of the inflation effect has never been more accurately perceived or more vividly described than it was by Thomas Jefferson. It will be asked, how will the two masses of continental and of state money have cost the people of the United States $72 millions when they are to be redeemed now with about $6 million? I answer that the difference, being 66 millions, has been lost on the paper bills separately by the successive holders of them. Every one, through whose hands a bill passed, lost on that bill what it lost in value during the time it was in his hands. This was a real tax on him, And in this way, the people of the United States actually contributed those $66 million during the war, and by a mode of taxation, the most oppressive of all, because the most unequal of all. Price controls and legal tender laws. It was natural that people struggled to find ways to escape the destruction of their savings. And the two most obvious methods were, 1, to regularly adjust prices upward as the value of the money went downward, or 2, exchange their goods and services only for gold coins. In response, the colonial legislatures and the Continental Congress did what governments always do to prevent it. They resorted to wage and price controls and to legal tender laws with harsh penalties for noncompliance. Under one such law, those who refused to accept worthless money were even described as traitors. It declared, "If any person shall hereafter be so lost to all virtue and regard for his country as to refuse to accept its notes, such person shall be deemed an enemy of his country." Rhode Island not only leveled a substantial fine for non-acceptance of its notes, but, upon a second offense, an individual lost his citizenship. When this was declared unlawful by a panel of judges, the legislature reacted by dismissing the judges from office. Then, as now, those who suffered the most from fiat money were those who held the most trust in government. In 1777, these were mostly the Whigs, for it was they who patriotically held paper money and, as a result, lost their livelihoods and their life savings. The Tories, on the other hand, mistrusting both government and its paper money, passed the bills as quickly as possible in trade for real assets, especially gold. Consequently, as a group, they weathered the storm fairly well. But they often were derided by their less prudent neighbors as Tory speculators, hoarders, and even traitors. All of this was painfully fresh in the memories of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and, as the opening session convened in Philadelphia in 1787, there were angry mobs in the streets threatening the legislators. Looting was rampant. Businesses were bankrupt. Drunkenness and lawlessness were everywhere to be seen. The fruit of fiat money had ripened, and the delegates did not enjoy its taste. In October of 1785, George Washington wrote, "The wheels of government are clogged, and we are descending into the vale of confusion and darkness." A year later, in a letter to James Madison, he said, "No day was ever more clouded than the present. We are fast verging to anarchy." In February of 1787, Washington wrote to Henry Knox, "If any person had told me that there would have been such formidable rebellion as exists, I would have thought him fit for a madhouse." Just 3 months prior to the opening of the convention, Washington voiced his reasons for rejecting the notion of fiat money. In answer to the complaint that there was not enough gold coin, specie, to satisfy the needs of commerce, he replied, "The necessity arising from a want of specie is represented as greater than it really is. I contend that it is by the substance, not the shadow of a thing, we are to be benefited. The wisdom of man, in my humble opinion, cannot at this time devise a plan by which the credit of paper money would be long supported. Consequently, depreciation keeps pace with the quantity of the emission, and articles for which it is exchanged rise in a greater ratio than the sinking value of the money. Wherein, then, is the farmer, the planter, the artisan benefited? An evil equally great is the door it immediately opens for speculation, by which the least designing and perhaps most valuable part of the community are preyed upon by the more knowing and crafty speculators." The Constitutional Convention. This was the prevailing view held by the great majority of delegates to the convention. They were adamant in their resolve to create a constitution which would prevent any state, and especially the federal government itself, from ever again issuing fiat money. And they said so in unmistakable terms. Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut, who later was to become our third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said, "This is a favorable moment to shut and bar the door against paper money." The mischief of the various experiments which have been made are now fresh in the public mind and have excited the disgust of all the respectable parts of America. George Mason from Virginia told the delegates he had a mortal hatred to paper money. Previously, he had written to George Washington, They may pass a law to issue paper money, but 20 laws will not make the people receive it. Paper money is founded upon fraud and knavery. James Wilson from Pennsylvania said, "It will have the most salutary influence on the credit of the United States to remove the possibility of paper money." John Langdon from New Hampshire warned that he would rather reject the whole plan of federation than to grant the new government the right to issue fiat money. George Reed from Delaware declared that a provision in the Constitution granting the new government the right to issue fiat money would be as alarming as the mark of the beast in Revelation. Thomas Paine, although not a delegate to the convention, had written the previous year that he was strongly opposed to fiat money, which he called counterfeiting by the state, and he especially abhorred legal tender laws, which force people to accept the counterfeit. He said, "The punishment of a member of a legislature who should move for such a law ought to be death." An interesting thought. If any further evidence is needed that the Founding Fathers intended to prohibit the federal government from issuing bills of credit, consider this. The first draft of the Constitution was copied in large measure from the original Articles of Confederation. When it was taken up for consideration by the delegates, therefore, it contained the old provision that had caused so much chaos. It stated, "The legislature of the United States shall have the power to borrow money and emit bills of credit." But, after a lively discussion on the matter, the offending provision was voted to be removed from the Constitution by an overwhelming margin. Voicing the sentiment of the majority of the delegates, Alexander Hamilton said, "To emit an unfunded paper as the sign of value ought not to continue a formal part of the Constitution, nor ever hereafter to be employed, being, in its nature, repugnant with abuses and liable to be made the engine of imposition and fraud." The Journal of the Convention for August 16th contains this notation. It was moved and seconded to strike out the words and emit bills of credit, and the motion passed in the affirmative. The vote cleared by a margin of better than 4-1. The 10th Amendment states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." The power to issue bills of credit is definitely not delegated to the United States, and it is specifically prohibited to the states. Therefore, if any power to issue fiat money legally exists at all, it is reserved for the people. In other words, individuals and private institutions, such as banks, have the right to issue IOUs and hope that the public will use them as money, but government, at any level, is clearly prohibited by the Constitution from doing so. A suggestion for your congressman. Incidentally, the Constitution has never been amended on this point, nor has the provision that only silver and gold can be used as lawful money. It would be interesting if each reader of this book would send copies to his or her elected representatives in Washington, or at least a photocopy of this section. Every member of Congress has sworn to uphold the Constitution, and you might attach a short note asking them when they intend to begin. Do not be disappointed if your reply is less than satisfactory. Politicians have a similar problem to that which judges have. It is permissible to rock the boat from time to time, but they're not supposed to sink it. Suits against the government challenging the constitutionality of our monetary system seldom get to court. It is safer for the justices to decline to accept these cases or to dismiss them as supposedly frivolous. Otherwise, they would face a difficult choice. Either they would have to mutilate logic in order to uphold the present inconsistencies, thus opening themselves to possible ridicule, or they would have to declare in favor of the Constitution and literally cause the collapse of the entire deficit spending central bank mechanism. Such an act would take a considerable amount of courage. Not only would they suffer the wrath of the establishment that is nourished by that mechanism, they also would have to face a bewildered public which, because of lack of knowledge about the Constitution or the nature of money, could easily be convinced that the judges had lost their minds. Likewise, it is safer for politicians to respond to inquiries of this kind merely by quoting some self-serving government document, which makes our fiat monetary system sound quite legal and marvelously constitutional. Unfortunately, that is reality. Until the public becomes considerably better informed than it is at present, we cannot expect too much from the courts or from Congress. Bringing this matter to the attention of your elected representatives, however, is still well worth the effort because the process of education has to start somewhere, and Washington is an excellent place to begin. Returning to the point of this digression, however, it is important to know that the federal government was given a precisely limited monetary function: to coin money and to regulate the value thereof. In view of the fact that gold and silver coin was specifically defined as the only kind of money to be allowed, there can be no doubt of what was meant by the first half of that power. To coin money meant to mint precious metal coins. Period. The second half is equally clear. Both in the Constitution and in the discussions among the delegates, the power to regulate the value of gold and silver coin was closely tied to the power to determine weights and measures. They are, in fact, one and the same. To regulate the value of coin is exactly the same as to set the nationally accepted value of a mile or a pound or a quart. It is to create a standard against which a thing may be measured. The wording of this section of the Constitution can be traced to the original Articles of Confederation, which further clarifies the meaning that was generally understood at that time. The United States in Congress assembled shall have a sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the alloy and value of coin struck by their OWN authority or by that of the respective states, fixing the standard of weights and measures throughout the United States. The intent, therefore, was simply for Congress to determine the exact weight of a precious metal that would constitute the national monetary unit. The origin of the dollar. At the time of these deliberations, Spanish silver coins, called pieces of 8, had already become the de facto monetary unit. An official commission had been established by the Continental Congress to sample the circulating coins in the country and determine their average value by weight and purity. Charts were published, and all coins of various origin were listed by comparative value. Congress was already regulating the value of the nation's money by the time the Constitution was drafted. How these coins became dollars is an interesting story. Edwin Vieira tells us, monetary historians generally first associate the dollar with one Count Schlick, who began striking such silver coins in 1519 in Joachimsthal, Bavaria. Then called Schlichtenthalers or Joachimsthalers, the coins became known simply as thalers, which transliterated into dollars. Interestingly, the American colonies did not adopt the dollar from England, but from Spain. Under that country's monetary reform of 1497, the silver real became the Spanish money unit, or unit of account. A new coin consisting of 8 reals also appeared, variously known as pesos, duros, países de ocho, pieces of 8, or Spanish dollars, because of their similarity in weight and fineness to the thaler. The coins quickly achieved predominance in financial markets of the NEW world because of Spain's then important commercial and political position. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson urged the adoption of the Spanish silver dollar as the nation's official monetary unit. In a pamphlet submitted to the delegates of the Continental Congress, he said, "Taking into our view all money transactions, great and small, I question if a common measure, of more convenient size than the dollar, could be proposed. The unit or dollar is a known coin, and the most familiar of all to the minds of people. It is already adopted from south to north, has identified our currency, and therefore happily offers itself as an unit already introduced." On July 6, 1785, Congress unanimously voted to adopt the Spanish dollar as the official monetary unit of the United States. Jefferson realized, however, that this was not sufficient. Although the coin had been one of the most dependable in terms of weight and quality, it still varied in content between issues, and a way had to be found to rate one coin in value against another. That was, after all, the service that Congress was required to render when it was given the power to regulate the value of money. Jefferson came directly to the point when he said, "If we determine that a dollar shall be our unit, we must then say with precision what a dollar is. This coin is struck at different times, of different weight and fineness, is of different values." The logic voiced by Jefferson could not be ignored. 2 years later, after carefully examining the actual weight and fineness of the Spanish dollars currently in circulation, Congress defined the dollar. After ratification of the Constitution, a dollar would contain 371.25 grains of fine silver, and all items in commerce, including other coins, were to be measured in value against that standard. As the Spaniards continued to reduce the silver content of their coins, the pressure for the minting of an American dollar of predictable value began to mount. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in his 1791 report to Congress, urged the establishment of a federal mint and also presented a powerful case for maintaining an inviolable standard for the coins to be produced by that mint. He said, "The dollar originally contemplated in the money transactions of this country, by successive diminutions of its weight and fineness, has sustained a depreciation of 5%, and yet the NEW dollar has a currency in all payments in place of the old, with scarcely any attention to the difference between them. The operation of this in depreciating the value of property depending upon past contracts, and of all other property, is apparent. Nor can it require argument to prove that a nation ought not to suffer the value of the property of its citizens to fluctuate with the fluctuations of a foreign mint, or to change with the changes in the regulations of a foreign sovereign. The quantity of gold and silver in the national coins, corresponding with a given sum, cannot be made less than heretofore without disturbing the balance of intrinsic value, and making every acre of land, as well as every bushel of wheat, of less actual worth than in time past. This could not fail to distract the ideas of the community, and would be apt to breed discontent as well among those who live on the income of their money as among the poorer classes of the people, to whom the necessities of life would become dearer. Bimetallism. Note in the preceding quotation that Hamilton referred to both gold and silver coins, not merely silver. That is because it was precisely at this time that Congress began to consider a bimetallic coinage. In retrospect, this was a mistake, for, throughout history, bimetallism has never worked well very long. It always has led to confusion and, ultimately, the disappearance as money of one of the metals. This is because there is always a subtle shifting of the relative values between gold and silver, or any other two metals for that matter, depending on constantly changing supply and demand. We may set a value ratio of one to the other that is quite acceptable today, but eventually, that ratio will no longer reflect reality. The metal which grows in value over the other will be hoarded or possibly even melted down because it will bring a higher price as metal than it will as money. That is precisely what happened in the early days of our republic. It was determined after careful analysis of the free market that the value of gold at that time was approximately 15 times the value of silver. The Coinage Act of 1792 accordingly set the relative value of gold to silver at 15 to 1. It then authorized the federal government to mint gold coins called eagles, and it specified that their value was $10. In other words, the gold coins would be equal in value to 10 silver coins. 10 silver coins, each of 371.25 grains of fine silver, would contain a total of 3,712.5 grains. The content of the eagle, therefore, was 1/15 that amount, or 247.5 grains of fine gold. Contrary to popular misconception, Congress did not create a gold dollar. It didn't do that until 57 years later in the Coinage Act of 1849. In fact, it reaffirmed that the money of account of the United States shall be expressed in dollars or units, and again defined those units as coins containing 371.25 grains of pure silver. What Congress did do was authorize the minting of a gold coin and arbitrarily fix the value of the gold in that coin at 15 times the value of the dollar. And it also stated that all silver and gold coins produced in the federal mint were to be legal tender in accordance with their value, based on weight and purity relative to the standard of the silver dollar. Oh yes, another thing. It set the death penalty for anyone who debases the nation's coinage, a law which, if enforced today, would wipe out the House of Representatives, the Senate, the managerial level of the Treasury Department, and the presidency as well. Free coinage. Perhaps the most important provision of this act, however, was the establishment of what is called free coinage. Under free coinage, Any citizen may take raw silver or gold to the mint and, for a nominal fee, have it converted into coins for personal use. The government merely performs a technical function of creating the coin and stamping it with its insignia to certify the correct weight and purity. The state's role in this is exactly the same as inspecting the scales in a grocery store or the meter on a gasoline pump. It is merely fulfilling the constitutional requirement to set standards and verify the accuracy of weights and measures. Free coinage was to become an important part of the American success story, and it lasted until the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which not only terminated it, but even made it illegal for citizens to possess gold. We shall take a closer look at that dismal period in a later section, but for now, it is important to recall the greatness of our monetary system as it once was. Elgin Grosclose explains, "The principle of free coinage has proved its practical worth as a deterrent to debasement and depreciation. Where coinage is on private account, there is no profit to the state in tampering with the standard, and there is no opportunity for such practice by the individual. The circulation of coins of similar appearance and denomination, but of uncertain standard, the arbitrary and unpredictable modifications in the standard by autocratic government, the temptations to profit which were constantly dangled before despotic rulers. These were evils which had perplexed and harassed society and hindered the natural growth of economy since the days when coin money first appeared. By a stroke they were swept away. At the same time, the institution of free coinage, by giving stability and character to one of the chief instruments of organized economy, made possible a more vigorous and healthy commercial life, and gave prestige and increased substance to the government adopting it. Sound money and economic prosperity. This was indeed an auspicious beginning for the new nation, and the result was immediately observable in an upsurge in prosperity. The December 16th, 1789 edition of the Pennsylvania Gazette declared, "Since the federal Constitution has removed all danger of our having a paper tender, our trade is advanced 50%. But that was just the beginning." Historian Douglas North says that the years 1793 to 1808 were years of unparalleled prosperity. 3. Lewis Hacker describes the period as one of unexampled business expansion, one of the greatest, in fact, the United States has had. The exports of the country mounted from $19 millions in 1791 to $93 millions in 1801. Furthermore, the federal deficit, which amounted to 28% of expenditures in 1792, dropped to 21% in 1795. By 1802, the deficit had disappeared altogether and had been replaced by a surplus that was almost as large as the government's total spending. George Washington watched this economic miracle with great satisfaction and, in correspondence to his friend, Lafayette, the French statesman and former general in the Continental Army, commented, "Our country, my dear sir, is fast progressing in its political importance and social happiness." In a letter to Catherine Macaulay Graham, he said, "The United States enjoys a sense of prosperity and tranquility under the new government that could hardly have been hoped for." And in a letter to the American poet and diplomat, David Humphreys, Washington exclaimed, "Our public credit stands on that high ground which 3 years ago it would have been considered as a species of madness to have foretold." On the specific subject of paper money, without backing by gold or silver, Washington wrote, "Washington, we may one day become a great commercial and flourishing nation. But if in the pursuit of the means we should unfortunately stumble again on unfunded paper money or any similar species of fraud, we shall assuredly give a fatal stab to our national credit in its infancy." This, then, was the monetary blueprint laid down by the men who drafted our Constitution. In retrospect, about the only flaw one can find was the attempt to set a fixed ratio between the value of gold and silver. Rather than placing a dollar value on a gold coin, the mint should have imprinted the gold value in terms of weight and fineness. The free market then would have assigned an exchange value in terms of goods and services, and that automatically would have determined its correct monetary value as a ratio to the silver dollars which were bidding for the purchase of the same items. It was inevitable, therefore, that soon after the $10 eagle was created, the value of gold over silver began to climb higher than the prescribed ratio of 15 to 1, and the eagles ceased to circulate. In later years, with the discovery of the great gold fields in California and Australia, the process reversed itself, and silver dollars disappeared from commerce. But even though this bimetallism led to a discrepancy between the actual conversion ratio and that which the government had prescribed, nevertheless, it took place in the open market and no one was greatly injured by the inconvenience. Throughout it all, there was just one standard, the defined silver content of a dollar. Furthermore, both the silver and gold coins were of intrinsic value and totally honest in their measure. No nation could do more for the prosperity of its citizens than that. Summary: the Constitution prohibits both the states and the federal government from issuing fiat money. This was the deliberate intent of the Founding Fathers, who had bitter experience with fiat money before and especially during the Revolutionary War. In response to the need to have a precisely defined national monetary unit, Congress adopted the Spanish dollar, then currently in use, and defined the content of that dollar to be 371.25 grains of pure silver. With the establishment of a federal mint, American silver dollars were issued in accordance with that standard, and gold eagles also were produced, which were then equal in value to 10 silver dollars. Most importantly, free coinage was established wherein Americans were able to convert their raw silver and gold into national coins officially certified by the government as to their intrinsic value. The product of these measures was a period of sound money and great economic prosperity, a period that would come to an end only when the next generation of Americans forgot to read their history and returned to the use of paper money and bills of credit. The monetary plan laid down by the Founding Fathers was the product of collective genius. Nowhere in history can one find so many men in one legislative body who understood the fraud inherent in fiat money and the hidden taxation nature of inflation. There was never such an assembly of scholars and statesmen determined to set a safe course for the nation of their own creation. Literally, they handed us a treasure map. All we had to do was follow it to economic security and national prosperity. But, as we shall see in the following sections, that map was discarded when the lessons of history died out with those who had lived it. Chapter 16. The Creature Comes to America. The story of the Bank of North America, the nation's first central bank, which was formed even before the Constitution was drafted. The story of the first Bank of the United States, the nation's second central bank, which was formed in 1791. The massive inflation caused by both banks, the causes of their demise. It is a surprising fact that the United States had its first central bank even before the Constitution was drafted. It was chartered by the Continental Congress in the spring of 1781 and opened its doors the following year. There were great expectations at that time that the province of Canada would soon join the rebel colonies to form a union extending across the entire North American continent. In anticipation of that, the new financial institution was called the Bank of North America. The bank was organized by Robert Morris, a member of Congress, who was a leader of a group of politicians and merchants who wanted the new nation to imitate the mercantilism of England. They wanted high taxes to support a powerful, centralized government, high tariffs to subsidize domestic industry, a large army and navy, and the acquisition of colonial outposts to expand into foreign lands and markets. He was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who had profited greatly from war contracts during the Revolution. He had carefully studied the secret science of money and, by 1781, was widely considered to be the financial wizard of Congress. The Bank of North America was modeled closely after the Bank of England. Following the practice of fractional reserve, it was allowed to issue paper promissory notes in excess of actual deposits. But since some gold and silver had to be held in the vault, there were definite limits to how far that process could go. Banknotes were not forced on the people as legal tender for all debts, public and private, but the government did agree to accept them at their face value in payment of all taxes and duties, which made them as good as gold for that specific purpose. Furthermore, unlike the central banks of today, the Bank of North America was not given the power to directly issue the nation's money. Functioned as a central bank. On the other hand, the bank was given the right of monopoly in its field, which means there were no other bank notes allowed to circulate in competition. This, plus the fact that they were accepted at face value in payment of all federal and state taxes, plus the further fact that the federal government did not at that time have a functioning money of its own, made these bank notes attractive for use as a circulating medium of exchange. The intended result was that the bank's paper would be accepted as money, which for a while it was. Furthermore, the bank was made the official depository for all federal funds, and it almost immediately loaned $1.2 million to the government, much of which was created out of nothing for that purpose. So, in spite of the limitations placed upon the bank, and in spite of the fact that it was essentially a private institution, it was intended to be, and, in fact, did function as a central bank. The Bank of North America was fraudulent from the very start. The charter required that private investors provide $400,000 for the initial subscription. When Morris was unable to raise that money, he used his political influence to make up the shortfall out of government funds. In a maneuver that was nothing less than legalized embezzlement, he took the gold that had been loaned to the United States from France and had it deposited in the bank. Then, using this as a fractional reserve base, he simply created the money that was needed for the subscription and loaned it to himself and his associates. Such is the power of the secret science. It is hard to reconcile the fact that the same men who adopted the brilliant monetary restraints of the Constitution a few years later would have allowed the Bank of North America to exist. It must be remembered, however, that the war was still in progress when the charter was issued, and even the wisest of statesmen are often obliged to follow expediency in such times. One also must conclude that, while the Founding Fathers were wise on the nature of fiat money created by the government's printing press, they had not yet had extensive experience with the same mechanism hidden behind the obscurities of fractional reserve banking. In any event, the bank was not to have its charter renewed by Congress, and it did not survive beyond the end of the war. Murray Rothbard details its demise. Despite the monopoly privileges conferred upon the Bank of North America and its nominal redeemability in specie, the market's lack of confidence in the inflated notes led to their depreciation outside the bank's home base in Philadelphia. The bank even tried to bolster the value of its notes by hiring people to urge redeemers of its notes not to insist on specie, a move scarcely calculated to improve the long-run confidence in the bank. After a year of operation, Morris's political power slipped, and he moved quickly to shift the Bank of North America from a central bank to a purely commercial bank chartered by the state of Pennsylvania. By the end of 1783, the first experiment with a central bank in the United States had ended. A fitting epilogue to this story was written 200 years later when, in 1980, the first Pennsylvania Bank of Philadelphia, the oldest bank in the nation, was bailed out by the FDIC, an end run around the Constitution. It will be recalled that after the Bank of North America was terminated and after the Constitutional Convention closed the door on paper money, the United States enjoyed a period of unparalleled economic growth and prosperity. But while the door may have been closed, the window was still open. Congress was denied the power to print money, but it was not denied the power to borrow it. In the vocabulary of the common man, to borrow is to accept a loan of something that already exists. He is confused, therefore, when the banker issues money out of nothing and then says he is lending it. He appears to be lending, but, in reality, he is creating. Then, as now, the mysteries of banking vocabulary were not revealed to the average man, and it was difficult to understand how privately issued banknotes could serve precisely the same purpose as printing press money, with precisely the same disastrous results. That being the case, the monetary and political scientists decided to run the Constitution. Their plan was to establish a bank, to give that bank the power to create money, to lend most of that money to the government, and then to make sure the IOUs are accepted as money by the public. Congress, therefore, would not be emitting bills of credit. The bank would do that. Thus, the first Bank of the United States was conceived. The proposal was submitted to Congress in 1790 by Alexander Hamilton, who, at that time, was Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton, incidentally, was a former aide to Robert Morris, founder of the Bank of North America. So in that sense, his role in this matter is not surprising. What is surprising is the fact that Hamilton had been a staunch supporter of a sound currency during the Constitutional Convention. This is hard to reconcile, and one must suspect that even the most well-intentioned of men can become corrupted by the temptations of wealth and power. It is possible that Hamilton, Morris, and other Federalist leaders had hoped to keep the government out of the money-making business, not because it was the constitutional thing to do, but because that would leave the field clear for a central bank mechanism which, because it was further from public view and political control, could become their own private engine of profit. It would appear that the only other explanation is that these men were fickle in their views and did not really understand the implications of their acts. In view of their brilliance in all other matters, however, it is difficult to muster enthusiasm for that interpretation. The Hamilton-Jefferson conflict. Hamilton's proposal was strongly opposed by Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, and this was the beginning of a heated political debate that would preoccupy Congress for many decades to come. In fact, it was one of the central issues that led to the creation of our first political parties. The Federalists gathered around the ideas of Hamilton. The Anti-Federalists, later called the Republicans, were attracted to the ideas of Jefferson. Jefferson pointed out that the Constitution did not grant to Congress the power to create a bank or anything similar. That means such power is reserved to the states or to the people. In a rebuttal to Hamilton's proposal, he said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. 1. Furthermore, H.E. said, even if the Constitution had granted such power, it would be an extremely unwise thing to do, because allowing banks to create money could only lead to national ruin. Hamilton, on the other hand, argued that debt was a good thing if kept within reason, and that the nation needed more money in circulation to keep up with expanding commerce. Only the bank, he said, will be able to provide that. Furthermore, while it is true the Constitution did not specifically grant the power to create such a bank, it was, nevertheless, an implied power because it was needed to accomplish other functions which were granted in the Constitution. That was the end run. Nothing could be more polarized than the opposing ideas of these two men. Jefferson. A private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. W. You must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. Hamilton. No society could succeed which did not unite the interest and credit of rich individuals with those of the state. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. America's second central bank is created. After a year of intense debate, Hamilton's views prevailed, and in 1791, Congress granted a 20-year charter to the Bank of the United States. It was modeled closely after the Bank of England, which means it was almost an exact replica of the previous Bank of North America. In fact, as evidence of continuity with the past, the president of the new bank was Thomas Willing, the same man who had been a partner of Robert Morris and president of the old bank. As before, the new bank was given a monopoly in the issuance of bank notes. Once again, these notes were not forced on the people as legal tender for private debts and contracts, but they were legal tender at face value for all debts to the government in the form of taxes and duties, which made them attractive for use as common money. And once again, the bank was made the official depository of all federal funds. The charter specified that the bank was required at all times to redeem its notes in gold or silver specie upon demand by the depositor. That was an admirable provision, but since the bank was not also required to keep specie in its vaults in the full amount of its note obligations, it was a mathematical impossibility to uphold. As with the old Bank of North America, the new Bank of the United States was to have 80% of its capital provided by private investors, with the federal government putting up only 20%. That was a mere bookkeeping sleight of hand. However, because it had been prearranged for the bank to immediately loan back to the federal government exactly that same amount. Reminiscent of the Morris scheme in capitalizing the Bank of North America, this federal investment was essentially a means whereby federal funds could be used to make up the shortfall of the private investors. "Call it by what name you please," said Jefferson. This was not a loan or an investment, but an outright gift. And he was certainly right. The bank was able to open its doors with less than 9% of the private capital required by its charter. The total capitalization was specified at $10 million, which means that $8 million was to come from private stockholders. However, as John Kenneth Galbraith wryly observed, numerous thrifty participants confined themselves to a modest down payment, and the bank began operations on around $675,000 in hard cash. The creature comes from Europe. Who were these private investors? Their names do not appear in the published literature, but we can be certain they included the congressmen and senators and their associates who engineered the charter. But there is an interesting line in Galbraith's text that hints at another dimension to the composition of this group. On page 72 of Money, whence it came, where it went, he states matter-of-factly, foreigners could own shares but not vote them. What a story is hidden behind that innocuous statement. The blunt reality is that the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe was the dominant force, both financially and politically, in the formation of the Bank of the United States. Biographer Derek Wilson explains, over the years since N.M. Rothschild, the Manchester textile manufacturer, had bought cotton from the southern states, Rothschilds had developed heavy American commitments. Nathan had made loans to various states of the Union, had been, for a time, the official European banker for the U.S. government, and was a pledged supporter of the Bank of the United States. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, is more pointed. He says, under the surface, the Rothschilds long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were the power in the old Bank of the United States. The Rothschilds, therefore, were not merely investors nor just an important power. They were the power behind the Bank of the United States. The significance of the Rothschild power in American finance and politics was the subject of extensive comment in a previous section, so there's no need to cover that ground again. It is important here, however, to at least make a mental note of the fact that the creature from Jekyll Island is descended from a species that is not native to this land. Inflation all over again. From the beginning, the primary purpose of the bank was to create money for the federal government. Money for the private sector was strictly secondary. That was made clear by the fact that the maximum rate of interest it was allowed to charge was 6%. That made it impractical to make loans to anyone except the federal government and a few large prime-rate borrowers. And the government wasted no time putting its new central bank mechanism to work. Having invested $2 million at the start, it converted that into $8.2 million borrowed within the next 5 years, which means that $6.2 million was created specifically for its use. Anyone familiar with the history of money as outlined in the previous section could easily write the following paragraph. The creation of millions of new fractional reserve dollars, which the government pushed into the economy through spending programs, caused an imbalance between the supply of money and the supply of goods and services. Prices appear to go up as the relative value of the dollar went down. In that same 5-year period, wholesale prices rose by 72%, which is another way of saying that 42% of everything people had saved in the form of money was quietly confiscated by the government through the hidden tax called inflation. The same inflation effect that previously had plagued the colonies now returned to plague the new generation. This time, instead of being caused by printing press money, it was fractional reserve money, the cog that linked the two mechanisms together and caused them to function as one was federal debt. It was federal debt that allowed the political and monetary scientists to violate the intent of the Founding Fathers, and it was this same federal debt that prompted Jefferson to exclaim, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government to the general principle of the Constitution. I mean an additional article taking from the federal government their power of borrowing. Like so many things in the real world, the Bank of the United States was a mixture of evil with some good. It certainly was not all bad. In colonial times, the state governments printed as much paper money as they pleased, and the loss of purchasing power was, in many cases, total. The bank, on the other hand, was required to maintain some gold and specie as a base for its pyramid of money. Even though it was an inverted pyramid with reserves being smaller than the quantity of banknotes, it still represented a boundary to just how far the money supply could be expanded. And that was good. Furthermore, it is apparent that the bank's directors were imbued with a certain amount of enlightened self-interest in that they actually wanted to keep the creation of new money within some kind of control. They could profit from the central bank mechanism only so long as the economy as a whole was productive enough to support it. They did not want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So, like their counterparts in the Federal Reserve System of our modern day, they spoke the language of restraint and, in a few instances, even acted with restraint as well. Wildcat banks. For example, it was during this period that wildcat banks began to flourish. They were given that name not because they were untamed, although that would have been another good reason to do so, but because they were located in areas so remote in the frontier that it was said their only customers were wildcats. Wildcat banks were not noted for meticulous accounting or business practices. Like all banks at that time, they were required to keep a certain portion of their deposits on hand in the form of gold or silver coin. To engender public confidence in their faithfulness to that obligation, it was common practice to keep the vault door open so a keg or two of gold coins could be viewed during business hours. Not altogether different from the modern practice of financial institutions advertising how many billions in assets they hold, but never mentioning the size of their liabilities. The wildcatters, however, were not reluctant to sprinkle a few precious metal coins over the top of nails and let that take care of public relations. In some cases, as state examiners went from bank to check the reserves, the gold would arrive only a few minutes ahead of them, having been rushed from the vault of the bank previously audited. The point is that the Bank of the United States was able to place considerable restraint upon the practices of all banks, both wildcat and urban. It did this simply by refusing to accept the notes of any other bank unless it had a reputation for redeeming those notes in specie on demand. The public reacted accordingly. If the notes were not good enough for the Bank of the United States, they were not good enough for them either. This served as an indirect force of moderation that affected all banks of that time. And that too was good. Some historians have said that the bank was a positive force in yet another way. Galbraith, for example, writes admiringly, on occasion, the Bank of the United States, CAME to the assistance of good state banks that WE are being besieged by their note holders or other creditors. So, besides enforcing restraint, it served also as the lender of last resort. Thus, in its short span of life, it went far to perceive and develop the basic regulatory functions of a central bank. One who is less enamored with the idea of a central bank would be tempted to ask, if those state banks were so good, why did they need assistance in keeping faith with their depositors? The whole idea of a lender of last resort, which is accepted as sacred dogma today, is based on the assumption that it is perfectly acceptable for the entire banking system to be fraudulent. It is assumed that any single bank or cluster of banks could at any time become besieged by their note holders or other creditors. Therefore, it is prudent to have a central bank to take what meager reserves there are within the system and rush them from bank to bank, if not minutes before the examiner arrives, at least before the customers do. As for the much talked about restraint exercised over other banks, it is not unreasonable to think that this same effect would have developed even without the presence of a government bank. If the free market had been left to operate, it is certain that, before long, one or more banks would gain a deserved reputation for honesty and full faith with their depositors. They would become the most popular banks and, therefore, the most prosperous. In order to accomplish this, however, they would have to reject the worthless notes of other banks. The public would react as expected, and even the most unscrupulous banks would have to toe the line if they wanted to survive. Moderation would be forced on the entire banking system as a result of open competition within a free market. To assume that only a federally chartered central bank could have brought moderation into the monetary system is to believe that only politicians, bureaucrats, and agencies of government can act with integrity, a shaky notion at best. An instrument of plutocracy. In any event, there is no denying the fact that the Bank of the United States did provide some braking force to the runaway tendencies of many of the nation's private banks. So it could have been worse. The inflation that it caused by its own activities could have been enlarged even further by the activities of the other banks as well. But that it could have been worse does not make it good. As it was, the bank was the means by which the American people lost 42% of the value of all the money they earned or possessed during just those 5 years. We must not forget, either, that this confiscation of property was selective. It did not work against the wealthy classes which were able to ride the wave of inflation aboard the raft of tangible property which they owned. And it especially did not work against those elite few, the political and monetary scientists, who were making huge profits from the enterprise. The bank had done precisely what Hamilton had advocated: unite the interest and credit of rich individuals with those of the state. The development of this plutocracy was well described by Gouverneur Morris, the former delegate from New York who had helped to draft the Constitution into its final form. He had been an assistant to Robert Morris, not related, and was a champion of the concept of a natural aristocracy. So he knew his subject well when he warned, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did. They always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere, if we do not, by such a government, keep them within their proper spheres." We should remember that the people never act from reason alone. The rich will take advantage of their passions and make these the instruments for oppressing them. The result of the contest will be a violent aristocracy or a more violent despotism. The tide of political pressure against the bank was steadily rising during these years. It is tempting for critics of the central bank mechanism to attribute that to the awakening common sense of the American public. Unfortunately, the picture is not that pleasing. It is true that the Jeffersonian Republicans were eloquently holding forth against the creature's progenitor, and their influence was substantial. But there was another group that joined with them which had almost exactly opposite ideas and goals. The Jeffersonians opposed the bank because they believed it was unconstitutional and because they wanted a monetary system based only upon gold and silver coin. The other group was made up of the wildcatters, the land speculators, and the empire-building industrialists. They opposed the bank because they wanted a monetary system with no restraints at all, not even those associated with fractional reserve. They wanted every local bank to be free to create as much paper money as the public would swallow, because they would then use that money for their own projects and profit. Indeed, politics does produce strange bedfellows. As the time approached for renewal of the bank's charter, the battle lines inched toward each other. They were of equal force. The halls of Congress echoed with the cannon roar of angry debate. The vote was deadlocked. Another attack and counterattack. Again a deadlock. Into the night, the forces clashed. When the smoke of battle lifted, the bill for charter renewal had been defeated by me vote in the House and one vote, cast by Vice President George Clinton to break the tie, in the Senate. And so, on January 24th, 1811, the Bank of the United States closed its doors. The battle may have been decided, but the war was far from over. The losers, bitter with defeat, merely regrouped their forces and began to prepare for the next encounter. Unfortunately, the events that followed were ideally suited for their plans. With the moderating effect of the bank now removed from the scene, the nation's banking system passed wholly into the hands of the state charter corporations, many of which were imbued with the wildcat mentality. Their numbers grew rapidly, and so did the money supply which they created. Inflation followed in their footsteps. Public dissatisfaction began to rise. If the free market had been allowed to operate, it is likely that competition soon would have weeded out the wildcatters and restored balance to the system, but it was never given a chance. The War of 1812 saw to that. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 was one of the most senseless wars in history. The primary cause, we are told, was the British impressment into their navy of American sailors on the high seas to assist in the war against Napoleonic France. But the French had done exactly the same thing to assist in the war against England, yet their acts were ignored. Furthermore, the British had already rescinded their policy regarding American seamen before the war was underway, which means that the cause of the war had been removed, and peace could have been restored in honor if Congress had so wanted. One must conclude that the pro-banking interests in the United States actually wanted the conflict because of the profits that could be realized from it. As evidence of this is the fact that the New England states, which were home to the seamen who had been impressed into service, were firmly against the war, while the western and inland southern states, which were home to the myriad of wildcat banks, howled loudly for a clash of arms. In any event, the war was unpopular with the average citizen, and it was out of the question for Congress to obtain funding for armaments through an increase in taxes. So the government needed the state banks to create that money outside the tax structure and came to their rescue to protect them from the discipline of the free market. It was a classic case of the unholy alliance, the cabal that always develops between political and monetary scientists. Professor Rothbard gives the details. The U.S. government encouraged an enormous expansion in the number of banks and in bank notes and deposits to purchase the growing war debt. These new and recklessly inflationary banks in the Middle Atlantic, Southern, and Western states printed enormous quantities of new notes to purchase government bonds. The federal government then used these notes to purchase arms and manufacture goods in New England. By August 1814, it became clear that the banks of the nation apart from NEW England could not pay in specie, that they were insolvent. Rather than allow the banks of the nation to fail, the governments, state and federal, decided in August 1814 to allow the banks to continue in business while refusing to redeem their obligations in specie. In other words, the banks were allowed to refuse to pay their solemn contractual obligations. This general suspension was not only highly inflationary at the time, it set a precedent for all financial crises from then on. Whether the creature from Jekyll Island, the U.S. had a central bank or not, the banks were assured that if they inflated together and then got in trouble, government would bail them out. The state banks had created enough instant money for the federal government to raise the debt from $45 million to $127 million, a staggering sum for the fledgling nation. Tripling the money supply, with no appreciable increase in goods, means the value of the dollar shrank to about one-third its former purchasing power. By 1814, when the depositors began to awake to the scam and demanded their gold instead of paper, the banks closed their doors and had to hire extra guards to protect officials and employees from the angry crowds. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had succeeded in fleecing the American public of approximately 66% of all the money they held during that period, and that was on top of the 42% fleecing they got a few years earlier by the Bank of the United States. Juggling tricks and banking dreams. Leaning against the storm of paper money all this time was Thomas Jefferson, by now past President of the United States. Trying to bring the nation to its senses, he never ceased speaking out against the evil of dishonest money and debt. Although all the nations of Europe have tried and trodden every path of force and folly in a fruitless quest of the same object, yet we still expect to find in juggling tricks and banking dreams that money can be made out of nothing, and in sufficient quantity to meet the expense of heavy war. The toleration of banks of paper discount cost the United States one-half of their war taxes, or, in other words, doubles the expenses of every war. The crisis, then, of the abuses of banking has arrived. The banks have pronounced their own sentence of death. Between $200 and $300 million of their promissory notes are in the hands of the people for solid produce and property sold, and the banks, formally declare that they will not pay them. Paper was received on a belief that it was cash gold, and such scenes are in a West to take place as will open the eyes of credulity and of insanity itself to the dangers of a J. Daper medium abandoned to the discretion of avarice and of swindlers. It is a wise rule never to borrow a dollar without laying a tax at the same instant for paying the interest annually and the principal within a given term. We shall consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debts, and morally bound to pay them ourselves. The earth belongs to the living, not the dead. We may consider each generation as a distinct nation with a right to bind themselves, but not the succeeding generation. The modern theory of the perpetuation of debt has drenched the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating. And still, Congress did not listen. Summary: America had its first central bank even before the Constitution was drafted. It was called the Bank of North America and was chartered by the Continental Congress in 1781. Modeled after the Bank of England, it was authorized to issue more paper promissory notes than it held in deposits. In the beginning, these notes were widely circulated and served as a national currency. Although the bank was essentially a private institution, it was designed for the purpose of creating money to lend to the federal government, which it did from the start. The Bank of North America was riddled with fraud, and it quickly fell into political disfavor. Its inflated bank notes eventually were rejected by ordinary citizens and ceased to circulate outside of the bank's home city of Philadelphia. Its charter was allowed to expire, and, in 1783, it was converted into a purely commercial bank chartered by the state of Pennsylvania. The advocates of fiat money did not give up. In 1791, the first bank of the United States, America's second central bank, was created by Congress. The new bank was a replica of the first, including fraud. Private investors in the bank were among the nation's most wealthy and influential citizens, including some congressmen and senators. But the largest investment and the most powerful influence in the new bank came from the Rothschilds in Europe. The bank set about immediately to serve its function of creating money for the government. This led to a massive inflation of the money supply and rising prices. In the first 5 years, 42% of everything people had saved in the form of money was confiscated through the hidden tax called inflation. This was the same phenomenon that had plagued the colonies less than 2 decades earlier. But instead of being caused by printing press money, it was now fueled by fractional reserve bank notes created by a central bank. As the time for renewal of the bank's charter approached, 2 groups with opposite intentions became strange political allies against it. The Jeffersonians, who wanted sound money, and the frontier banks, called wildcatters, who wanted unlimited license to steal. On January 24, 1811, the charter was defeated by 1 vote in the Senate and 1 in the House. The central bank was gone, but the wildcatters were everywhere. The War of 1812 was not popular among the American public, and funding would have been impossible through taxes alone. The government chose to fund the war by encouraging wildcat banks to purchase its war debt bonds and convert them into banknotes, which the government then used to purchase war material. Within 2 years, the nation's money supply had tripled, and so had prices. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had succeeded in fleecing the American public of approximately 66% of all the money they held during that period. And that was on top of the 42% fleecing they got a few years earlier by the Bank of the United States. Chapter 17. A Den of Vipers. The story of the second Bank of the United States, the nation's third central bank, the election of Andrew Jackson on an anti-bank platform, the battle between President Jackson and the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, the deliberate creation of a depression to frighten the public into keeping the bank, Jackson's ultimate victory, the monetary chaos that existed at the end of the War of 1812, outlined in the previous chapter, was caused by an almost universal fraud within the banking industry. Depositors in good faith placed their gold and silver into banks for safekeeping and for the convenience of using paper money in their everyday transactions. The banks, in turn, promised them they could exchange the paper for their coins whenever they wished. At the same time, however, through the mechanism of fractional reserve banking, paper money was created far in excess of the value of the coins held in reserve. Since the new money had just as much claim to the coins as the old, The bankers knew that if a sizable percentage of their customers were to request a withdrawal of their coins, that solemn promise simply could not be kept. This, in fact, is precisely what happened over and over again during that period. By 1814, Thomas Jefferson had retired to Monticello and had bitterly resigned himself to defeat on the issue of money. In a letter to John Adams, he said, "I have ever been the enemy of banks, not of those discounting for cash, that is, charging interest on loans of real money, but of those foisting their own paper into circulation and thus banishing our cash. My zeal against those institutions was so warm and open at the establishment of the Bank of the U.S. that I was derided as a maniac by the tribe of bankmongers, who were seeking to filch from the public their swindling and barren gains. Shall we build an altar to the old paper money of the Revolution, which ruined individuals but saved the Republic, and burn on that all the bank charters present and future, and their notes with them? For these are to ruin both Republic and individuals. This cannot be done. The mania is too strong. It has seized by its delusions and corruptions all the members of our governments, general, special, and individual." Jefferson was right. Congress had neither the wisdom nor the courage to let the free market clean up the mess that remained after the demise of the first bank of the U.S. If it had, the fraud soon would have become understood by the public. The dishonest banks would have folded, the losses would have been taken, and the suffering would have been ended, perhaps forever. Instead, Congress moved to protect the banks, to organize the fraud, and to perpetuate the losses. All of this was accomplished in 1816 when a 20-year charter was given to the Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States. In every respect, the new bank was a carbon copy of the old, with one minor exception. Congress unashamedly extracted from the private investors what amounted to nothing less than a bribe in the form of $1.5 million in consideration of the exclusive privileges and benefits conferred by this act. The bankers were glad to pay the fee, not only because it was a modest price for such a profitable enterprise, but also because, as before, they received an immediate government deposit of 1/5 the total capitalization, which then was used as the base for manufacturing much of the remaining startup capital. The charter required the bank to raise a minimum of $7 million in specie, but even in its second year of operation, its specie never rose above $2.5 million. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had carved out their profitable niches, and the gullible taxpayer, his head filled with sweet visions of banking reform, was left to pick up the tab. Another important continuity between the old and the new bank was the concentration of foreign investment. In fact, the largest single block of stock in the new bank, about 1/3 in all, was held by this group. It is certainly no exaggeration to say that the Second Bank of the United States was rooted as deeply in Britain as it was in America. The nation's third central bank ran into deep trouble from the start. It had promised to continue the tradition of moderating the other banks by refusing to accept any of their notes unless they were redeemable in specie on demand. But when the other banks returned the gesture and required that the new bank also pay out specie on their demand, it frequently lost its resolve. There is also the tiny matter of corruption. As the bank's major historian writes, so many influential people were interested in the state banks as stockholders that it was not advisable to give offense by demanding payment in specie, and borrowers were anxious to keep the banks in the humor to lend. In economics, every policy carries a consequence, and the consequence of the loose monetary policy of the Second Bank of the United States was that America was introduced to her first experience with what now is called the boom-bust cycle. Galbraith tells us, in 1816, the post-war boom was full on. There was especially active speculation in Western lands. The new bank joyously participated. The bank had the advantage over its competitors of a federal charter plus the government's agreement to accept its notes in the payment of taxes. But the state banks were by no means left out of the game. It was still within their power to create money through fractional reserve banking and, thus, to further inflate the amount of the nation's circulating currency. Anxious to get in on this action, Pennsylvania chartered 37 new banks in 1817. That same year, Kentucky followed suit with 40 new charters. The total number of banks grew by 46% in just the first 2 years after the central bank was created. Any spot along the road that had a church, a tavern, or a blacksmith shop was deemed a suitable place for setting up a bank. In that same time frame, the money supply was expanded by an additional $27.4 million, another taxpayer fleecing of over 40%. The first boom-bust cycle. In the past, the effect of this inflationary process always had been the gradual evaporation of purchasing power and the continuous transfer of property from those who produced it to those who controlled the government and ran the banks. This time, however, the process took on a new twist. Gradualism was replaced by catastrophism. The monetary scientists, with their hands firmly on the controls of the money machine, now began to throw the levers, first one way and then the other. The expansion and then deliberate contraction of the money supply literally threw the nation into economic convulsions. Why wait for the apples to fall when the harvest can be hastened simply by shaking the tree? In 1818, the bank suddenly began to tighten its requirements for new loans and to call in as many of the old loans as possible. This contraction of the money supply was justified to the public then exactly as it is justified today. It was necessary, they said, to put the brakes on inflation. The fact that this was the same inflation the bank had helped to create in the first place seems to have gone unnoticed. There is no doubt that many bankers and politicians act in good faith in their attempt to bring under control the inflation they themselves have caused. Not everyone who benefits from the central bank mechanism fully understands it. Like Frankenstein, they create a monster without realizing they cannot control it. Their crime is one of stupidity, not malice. But stupidity is not a characteristic of the average banker, especially a central banker, and we must conclude that many of the monetary scientists are well aware of the monster's power for destruction. At best, they just don't care as long as they are safe. And at worst, they perceive that they are in the apple harvesting business. They deliberately tease and prod the monster in anticipation of his rampage through the village orchards. In the final analysis, of course, it is of little importance whether the shaking of the trees is out of innocence or malice. The end result is the same. My, how the apples do fall. The country's first experience with a deliberately created monetary contraction began in 1818 when the bank became concerned about its own ability to survive. Professor Rothbard says, starting in July 1818, the government and the Bank of the United States began to see what dire straits they were in. The enormous inflation of money and credit, aggravated by the massive fraud, had put the bus in danger of going under and illegally failing to maintain specie payments. Over the next year, the bus began a series of enormous contractions, forced curtailment of loans, contractions of credit in the South and West. The contraction of money and credit swiftly brought to the United States its first widespread economic and financial depression. The first nationwide boom-bust cycle had arrived in the United States. The result of this contraction was a rash of defaults, bankruptcies of business and manufacturers, and a liquidation of unsound investments during the boom. The cycle is worsened by government interference. It is widely believed that panics, boom-bust cycles, and depressions are caused by unbridled competition between banks, thus the need for government regulation. The truth is just the opposite. These disruptions in the free market are the result of government prevention of competition by the granting of monopolistic power to a central bank. In the absence of a monopoly, individual banks may operate in a fraudulent manner only to a limited extent and for a short period of time. Inevitably, they will be exposed by their more honest competitors and will be forced out of business. Yes, their depositors will be injured by the bankruptcy, but the damage will be limited to a relatively few and will occur only now and then. Even geographical regions may be hard hit on occasion, but it will not be a national tragedy with everyone brought to their knees. The overall economy will absorb the losses, and commerce at large will continue to prosper. Within an environment of prosperity, even those who have been injured by fraudulent banking would have a good chance for rapid recovery. But when a central bank is allowed to protect the fraudulent operators and to force all banks to function the same, the forces of competition can no longer dampen the effect. The expansion becomes universal and gigantic. And, of course, so does the contraction. Except for the bankers and the politicians, everyone is injured at the same time. Depression is everywhere, and recovery is long delayed. This is exactly what happened in the so-called Panic of 1819. In the documentary History of Banking and Currency, Herman Kruse writes, "The bank, as the largest creditor to the state banks, had two alternatives. It could write off its debts, which of course would wipe out the stockholders' equity and result in bankruptcy, or it could force the state banks to meet their obligations, which would mean wholesale bankruptcy among state banks." There is no doubt about the choice. The pressure placed upon state banks deflated the economy drastically, and as the money supply wilted, the country sank into severe depression. As historian William Gouge observed, the bank was saved and the people were ruined. Competition between the national bank and the state banks during this period had been moved from the open field of the free market to the closed arena of politics. Free market competition had been replaced by government favoritism in the form of charters, which granted the right of monopoly. A federal charter was clearly better than one issued by a state, but the states fought back fiercely with what weapons they possessed, and one of those was the power to tax. Several states began to levy a tax on the paper notes issued by any bank doing business within their borders, which was not also locally chartered. The intent, although pretended to be the raising of state revenue, was really to put the federal bank out of business. The Supreme Court upholds the bank. When the bank refused to pay such a tax to the state of Maryland, the issue was taken to the Supreme Court in 1819 as the celebrated case of McCulloch v. Maryland. The Chief Justice at that time was John Marshall, a leading Federalist and advocate of a strong, centralized federal government. As was expected, the Marshall Court carefully tailored its decision to support the federal government's central bank. The narrow issue upon which the constitutionality of the bank was decided was not whether Congress had the power to directly or indirectly emit bills of credit or otherwise convert debt into money. If that had been the issue, the court would have been hard-pressed to uphold the bank, for that not only is expressly prohibited by the Constitution, it is precisely what the bank had been doing all along, and everyone knew it. Instead, the court focused upon the narrow question of whether or not the bank was a necessary and proper means for Congress to execute any other constitutional powers it might have. From that perspective, it was unanimously held that the bank was indeed constitutional. Were the bank's paper notes the same as bills of credit? No, because they were backed by the credit of the bank, not the federal government. True, the bank created money, and most of it was used by the government. Never mind all that. The Treasury did not print it, therefore it was not government money. Was not the bank the same as an agency of government? No, because merely granting a national monopoly and enforcing that monopoly with the power of the state does not necessarily make it state action. Furthermore, the states cannot tax the federal government or any of its instruments, including the Bank of the United States, because, as Marshall stated, the power to tax is the power to destroy. Here was another end run around the Constitution, executed this time by the very men who were assumed to be its most loyal defenders. The Supreme Court had spoken, but the court of public opinion had not yet disposed of the case. During the 1820s, popular sentiment shifted back to the laissez-faire and sound money principles espoused by the Jeffersonian Republicans. But since the Republican Party had by then abandoned those principles, a new coalition was formed, headed by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, to resurrect them. It was called the Democratic Party, and one of its agenda items was to abolish the Bank of the United States. After Jackson was elected to the presidency in 1828, he wasted no time in attempting to build congressional support for that goal. Nicholas Biddle. By this time, the bank had come under the direction of Nicholas Biddle, who was a formidable adversary to Jackson, not only because of the power of his position, but because of his strong will and sense of personal destiny. He was the archetype of the new Eastern establishment, wealthy, arrogant, ruthless, and brilliant. He had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania at the age of only 13, and, as a young man entering business, had fully mastered the secret science of money. With the ability to control the flow of the nation's credit, Biddle soon became one of the most powerful men in America. This was brought out dramatically when he was asked by a Senate committee if his bank ever took advantage of its superior position over the state banks. He replied, "Never. There are very few banks which might not have been destroyed by an exertion of the powers of the bank. None has ever been injured." 1. As Jackson publicly noted a few months later, this was an admission that most of the state banks existed only at the pleasure of the Bank of the United States, and that, of course, meant at the pleasure of Mr. Biddle. The year was 1832. The bank's charter was good for another 4 years. But Biddle decided not to wait that long for Jackson to build his forces. He knew that the president was up for re-election, and he reasoned that, as a candidate, he would hesitate to be too controversial. To criticize the bank is one thing, but to come down squarely for its elimination altogether would surely cost him many votes. So, Biddle requested Congress to grant an early renewal of the charter as a means of softening Jackson's campaign against it. The bill was backed by the Republicans led by Senator John Clay and was passed into law on July 3rd, just before the election campaigns began in earnest. Jackson overrides Congress. It was brilliant strategy on Biddle's part, but it didn't work. Jackson decided to place his entire political career on the line for this one issue, and, with perhaps the most passionate message ever delivered to Congress by any president, before or since, he vetoed the measure. The president's biographer, Robert Remini, says the veto message hit the nation like a tornado, for it not only cited constitutional arguments against Rec Harder, supposedly the only reason for resorting to a veto, but political, social, economic, and nationalistic reasons as well. Sponsored monopoly to the bank. 2. The unconstitutionality of the bank, even if it were not unjust. And 3. The danger to the country in having the bank heavily dominated by foreign investors. Regarding the injustice of a government-sponsored monopoly, he pointed out that the stock of the bank was owned only by the richest citizens of the country, and that, since the sale of stock was limited to a chosen few with political influence, the common man not only is unfairly excluded from an opportunity to participate, but he is forced to pay for his banking services far more than they are worth. Unearned profits are bad enough when they are taken from one class of citizens and given to another, but it is even worse when the people receiving those benefits are not even citizens at all, but are, in fact, foreigners. Jackson said, "It is not our own citizens only who are to receive the bounty of our government. More than 8 million of the stock of this bank are held by foreigners. By this act, the American Republic proposes virtually to make them a present of some millions of dollars. It appears that more than a fourth part of the stock is held by foreigners, and the residue is held by a few hundred of our own citizens, chiefly of the richest class. For their benefit, does this act exclude the whole American people from competition in the purchase of this monopoly and dispose of it for many millions less than it is worth?" Regarding the issue of constitutionality, he said that he was not bound by the previous decision of the Supreme Court because the President and Congress had just as much right to decide for themselves whether or not a particular law is constitutional. This view, incidentally, was not novel at that time. It is only in relatively recent decades that people have begun to think of the Supreme Court as being specifically authorized to pass on this question. In fact, as Jackson correctly pointed out in his veto message, the Founding Fathers created a government with power divided between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and that the purpose of this division was not merely to divvy up the chores, but to balance one branch against the other. The goal was not to make government efficient, but to deliberately make it inefficient. Each president and each legislator is morally bound, even by oath, to uphold the Constitution. If each of them does not have the power to decide in conscience what is constitutional, then taking an oath to uphold it has little meaning. The bank controlled by foreign investors. Regarding the danger to our national security, Jackson returned to the fact that a major portion of the bank stockholders were foreigners. Even though foreign investors technically were not allowed to vote their shares, their financial power was so great that the American investors were clearly beholden to them and would likely follow their instructions. Jackson concluded, "Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Is there not cause to tremble for the purity of our elections in peace and for the independence of our country in war? Of the course which would be pursued by a bank almost wholly owned by the subjects of a foreign power and managed by those whose interests, if not affections, would run in the same direction, there can be no doubt. Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy." Jackson saved the greatest passion of his argument for the end. Speaking now, not to Congress, but to the voters at large, he said, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favor alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. The veto did not defeat the bank. It was merely a declaration of war. The major battles were yet to come. Biddle's control over Congress. As commanding general of the pro-bank forces, Biddle had one powerful advantage over his adversary. For all practical purposes, Congress was in his pocket. Or, more accurately, the product of his generosity was in the pockets of congressmen. Following the Rothschild formula, Biddle had been careful to reward compliant politicians with success in the business world. Few of them were willing to bite the hand that fed them. Even the great senator, Daniel Webster, found himself kneeling at Biddle's throne. Galbraith says, Biddle was not without resources. In keeping with his belief that banking was the ultimate source of power, he had regularly advanced funds to members of Congress when delay on appropriations bills had held up their pay. Daniel Webster was, at various times, a director of the bank and on retainer as its counsel. I believe my retainer has not been renewed or refreshed as usual. If it be wished that my relation to the bank should be continued, it may be well to send me the usual retainers. Numerous other men of distinction had been accommodated, including members of the press. Webster is a particularly interesting study in how even so-called great men can be compromised by an addiction to wealth. He had always been an advocate of sound money in Congress, yet, as a lawyer on Biddle's payroll, he represented the bank's position before the Supreme Court in McSidlock v. Maryland. Much of the twisted logic that allowed the court to end-run the Constitution and destroy sound money came from his pen. After Jackson's veto of the bank's charter, Biddle requested Webster to deliver speeches specifically for the purpose of having the bank reprint them for mass distribution. In one of those speeches, Webster echoed the old refrain that the bank served as a moderating influence on the nation's other banks, and then piously proclaimed, Congress can alone coin money. No state, nor even Congress itself, can make anything a tender but gold and silver in the payment of debts. In an act of astounding hypocrisy, this speech was distributed widely by the very institution that was designed specifically for creating fractional fiat money, without gold or silver backing, to function as tender in the payment of debts. Then, as now, most people did not discern between words and actions and believed that this speech, delivered by such a great man, was evidence of the bank's worthiness. Biddle even distributed 300,000 copies of Jackson's veto message, apparently in the belief that many would not read it. Obviously cared if the bank thought it was so bad as to distribute it. It must be bad. The power of the bank's money was everywhere. It was as John Randolph, the fiery old Republican from Virginia, had said, "Every man you meet in this house or out of it, with some rare exceptions, which only serve to prove the rule, is either a stockholder, president, cashier, clerk, or doorkeeper, runner, engraver, papermaker, or mechanic in some other way to a bank." Jackson appeals directly to the voters. Congress, the banks, speculators, industrialists, and segments of the press. These are the forces commanded by Biddle. But Jackson had a secret weapon which had never been used before in American politics. That weapon was a direct appeal to the electorate. He took his message on the campaign trail and delivered it in words well chosen to make a lasting impression on the voter. He spoke out against a moneyed aristocracy which had invaded the halls of Congress, impaired the morals of the people, threatened their liberty, and subverted the electoral process. The bank, he said, was a hydra-headed monster eating the flesh of the common man. He swore to do battle with the monster and slay it or be slain by it. He bellowed his position to every crowd he could reach: bank and no Jackson, or no bank and Jackson. 3. On the subject of paper money, the president was equally emphatic. His biographer describes the campaign. On his homeward journey, he reportedly paid all his expenses in gold. "No more paper money, you see, fellow citizens," he remarked with each gold payment, "if I can only put down this Nicholas Biddle and his monster bank." Gold, hardly the popular medium of exchange, was held up to the people as the safe and sound currency which Jackson and his administration hoped to restore to regular use. Unlike paper money, gold represented real value and true worth. It was the coin of honest men. Rag money, on the other hand, was the instrument of banks and swindlers to corrupt and cheat an innocent and virtuous public. Jackson had awakened the indignation of the American people. When the November ballots were cast, he received a mammoth vote of confidence. He received 55% of the popular vote, with 37% for Clay, 8% for Wirt, and 80% of the vote in the Electoral College. But the war still was not over. Jackson won the election, but the bank had 4 more years to operate, and it intended to use those years to sway public sentiment back to its support. The biggest battles were yet to come. Jackson removes federal deposits. Jackson did not wait to act. He knew that time would be used as a weapon against him. "The hydra of corruption is only scotched, not dead," he said. Soon after the election, he ordered Secretary of the Treasury, William Duane, to place all new deposits of the federal government into various state banks around the country and to pay current expenses out of the funds still held by the Bank of the United States until that account was drained to zero. Without the use of federal money, surely the monster would perish. To Jackson's chagrin, however, Duane balked at the order out of a sincere conviction that, to do so, would be disruptive to the economy. This was not the first time a cabinet officer and a president had come to disagreement. In the past, however, the impasse had always been resolved by the resignation of the secretary. This time was different. Duane refused to resign, and that raised an interesting constitutional question. A president could appoint a member of the executive branch only with the consent of the Senate. The Constitution was silent, however, on the matter of dismissal. Did that, too, require Senate approval? The implication was that it did, but the issue had never been tested. Jackson had no patience for such theoretical questions. The letter arrived promptly on Duane's desk. "Your further services as Secretary of the Treasury are no longer required." On October 1st, 1833, federal deposits began to move out of the bank. Jackson felt that he finally had the monster firmly within his grasp. "I have it chained," he said. With gleeful confidence, he added, "I am ready with the screws to draw every tooth and then the stumps. If I am not mistaken," he went on, "we will have Mr. Biddle and his bank as quiet and harmless as a lamb in 6 weeks." Biddle deliberately creates monetary chaos. The president's view of the bank's meat captivity was premature, to say the least. Biddle responded, "Not like a lamb, but more like a wounded lion. His plan was to rapidly contract the nation's money supply and create another panic depression similar to the one the bank had created 13 years earlier. This then could be blamed on Jackson's withdrawal of federal deposits, and the resulting backlash surely would cause Congress to override the president's veto. Rimini tells us Biddle counterattacked. He initiated a general curtailment of loans throughout the entire banking system. It marked the beginning of a bone-crushing struggle between a powerful financier and a determined and equally powerful politician. Biddle understood what he was about. He knew that if he brought enough pressure and agony to the money market, only then could he force the president to restore the deposits. He almost gloated. This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken. The ties of party allegiance can only be broken, he declared, by the actual conviction of existing distress in the community. And such distress, of course, would eventually put everything to rights. Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to restoration of the currency and the record of the bank. My own course is decided. All other banks and all the merchants may break, but the Bank of the United States shall not break. One Biddle, therefore, decided to use the American people as sacrificial pawns in the giant chess match for the bank's survival. The resulting economic chaos is not difficult to imagine. Biddle's contraction of the money supply was executed at a particularly vulnerable moment. Business had been expanding as a result of the bank's prior easy credit and now was dependent on it. Also, the tariff came due at precisely this time, placing still more demand for cash and credit. Losses were sustained everywhere, wages and prices sagged. Men were put out of work, companies went bankrupt. By the time Congress reconvened in December, in what was called the panic session, the nation was in an uproar. Newspapers editorialized with alarm, and letters of angry protest flooded into Washington. As the pressure continued to build in Congress, it began to look as though Biddle's plan would work. In the public eye, it was Jackson who was solely responsible for the nation's woes. It was his arrogant removal of Secretary Duane. It was his foolish insistence on removing the deposits. It was his obstinate opposition to Congress. Jackson is censured by the Senate. For 100 days, a phalanx of orators daily excoriated the president for his arrogant and harmful conduct. At length, a resolution of censure was introduced into the Senate and, on March 28, 1834, it was passed by a vote of 26 to 20. This was the first time that a president had ever been censured by Congress, and it was a savage blow to Jackson's pride. Biddle at last had the upper hand. The president rumbled around the White House in a fit of rage. "You are a den of vipers," he said to a delegation of the bank supporters. "I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out." The censure was by no means indicative of popular sentiment. Even in the Senate, which was a hotbed of pro-bank support, a swing of only 3 votes would have defeated the measure. During all this time, imperceptibly at first, but quickly growing, the public had been learning the truth. Jackson, of course, was doing everything within his power to hasten the process, but other factors also were at work, not the least of which was Biddle himself. So large was his ego that he could not keep from boasting in public about his plan to deliberately disrupt the economy. People heard these boasts, and they believed him. The turning point came when Governor George Wolfe of Pennsylvania, the bank's home state, came out publicly with a strong denunciation of both the bank and Biddle. This was like the starting bell at a horse race. With the bank's home state turned against it, there was no one left to defend it, and, literally within days, the mood of the country and of Congress changed. The Democrats wasted no time consolidating these unexpected gains. To test their strength on the issue, on April 4, 1834, they called for a vote in the House on a series of resolutions which were aimed at nullifying the censure in the Senate. In essence, the resolutions stated that the House totally approved the president's bank policy. The first resolution, passed by a vote of 134 to 82, declared that the Bank of the United States ought not to be rechartered. The second, passed by a vote of 118 to 103, agreed that the deposits ought not to be restored. And the third, passed by an overwhelming vote of 175 to 42, called for the establishment of a special committee of Congress to investigate whether the bank had deliberately instigated the current economic crisis. It was an overwhelming victory for Jackson, which would be culminated a few years later with the passage of a resolution in the Senate which formally rescinded the previous vote of censure. Biddle defies Congress. When the investigating committee arrived at the bank's doors in Philadelphia armed with a subpoena to examine the books, Biddle flatly refused. Nor would he allow inspection of correspondence with congressmen relating to their personal loans and advances. And he steadfastly refused to testify before the committee back in Washington. For lesser mortals, such action would have resulted in citations of contempt of Congress and would have carried stiff fines or imprisonment. But not for Nicholas Biddle. Ramini explains, the committeeman demanded citation for contempt, but many Southern Democrats opposed this extreme action and refused to cooperate. As Biddle bemusely observed, it would be ironic if he went to prison by the votes of members of Congress because I would not give up to their enemies their confidential letters. Although Biddle escaped a contempt citation, his outrageous defiance of the House only condemned him still further in the eyes of the American public. The bank was still alive, but had been mortally wounded. By this time, Jackson had completely paid off the national debt incurred by the War of 1812 and had even run up a surplus. In fact, he ordered the Treasury to give back to the states more than $35 million, which was used for the construction of a wide variety of public works. With these accomplishments close on the heels of his victory over the bank, the president had earned the undying hatred of monetary scientists, both in America and abroad. It is not surprising, therefore, that on January 30th, 1835, an assassination attempt was made against him. Miraculously, both pistols of the assailant misfired, and Jackson was spared by a quirk of fate. It was the first such attempt to be made against the life of a president of the United States. The would-be assassin was Richard Lawrence, who either was truly insane or who pretended to be insane to escape harsh punishment. At any rate, Lawrence was found not guilty due to insanity. Later, he boasted to friends that he had been in touch with powerful people in Europe who had promised to protect him from punishment should he be caught. Point 3, the ending to this saga, holds no surprises. The bank's charter expired in 1836, and it was restructured as a state bank by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. After a spree of speculation in cotton, lavish advances to the bank's officers, and the suspension of payment in specie, Biddle was arrested and charged with fraud. Although not convicted, he was still undergoing civil litigation when he died. Within 5 years, the establishment was forced to close its doors forever, and America's third experience with central banking came to a close. Some bad mixed in with the good. It is tempting to let the story stop right there and allow Jackson to forever wear the crown of hero and dragon slayer. But a more balanced view of these events leads to the conclusion that the forces of virtue were not without contamination. Jackson represented the position of those who wanted only gold and silver for the nation's money. But this group was not large enough to match the power of the bank. He was joined in that battle by many groups which hated the bank for other, less admirable reasons. State banks and business interests along the expanding frontier, for example, were not the least interested in constitutional money. They wanted just the opposite. They viewed the modest restraints of the federal bank as excessive. With the federal bank out of the way, they anticipated no restraints at all. As we shall see in the following section, it is ironic that this is the group that got what it wanted, not the hard money Jacksonians. One cannot blame Jackson for accepting the support of these groups in his effort to slay the dragon. In politics, it often is necessary to make temporary alliances with one's opponents to achieve occasional common objectives. But Jackson went further than that. More than any other president before him, and rivaled by only a few since, he changed the character of American politics. He led the nation away from the new concept of diffused powers, carefully worked out by the Founding Fathers, back toward the old world tradition of concentration and monarchy. By strongly challenging the right of the states to secede from the Union, he set into motion a concept that not only would lead to civil war, but which would put an end forever to the ability of the states to check the expanding power of the federal government. No longer was the Union to be based on the principle of consent of the governed. It was now to be based on force of arms. And through the manipulation of voter passion on the bank issue, he changed the perception of the role of president from public servant to national leader. At the height of the battle against the bank, when Jackson was making a direct appeal to the voters for support, he declared, "The president is the direct representative of the people." To fully comprehend the significance of that statement, it must be remembered that the plan of the Constitution was for the president to be elected indirectly by the state legislatures, not by the voters at large. After fighting a war to throw off the rule of King George III, the Founding Fathers wanted nothing more to do with kings of any kind, and they went out of their way to make sure that the President of the United States would never be looked upon as such. They realized that an elected ruler, unless his power is carefully limited and diffused, can become just as despotic as an unelected one. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, therefore, established an electoral college to select the president. Members of the college are to be appointed by the states. Congressmen, senators, or other officers of the federal government are specifically and wisely excluded. The college is supposed to select a president strictly on the basis of his integrity and executive ability, not his party label, political connections, good looks, charisma, or stirring orations. The people may elect their congressman, but the Electoral College chooses the president. Thus, it was intended that the president would have a different constituency from Congress, and this difference was important to ensure the balance of power that the framers of the Constitution worked so hard to create. As a means of keeping government under control, it was a truly brilliant piece of political engineering. All of that was changed in the election of 1832. One of the sad facts of history is that good causes often are the occasion for establishing bad precedents. Jackson's fight against the Bank of the United States was one of those events. Summary: the government had encouraged widespread banking fraud during the War of 1812 as an expedient for paying its bills, and this had left the nation in monetary chaos. At the end of the war, instead of allowing the fraudulent banks to fall and letting the free market heal the damage, Congress decided to protect the banks, to organize the fraud, and to perpetuate the losses. It did this by creating the nation's third central bank called the Second Bank of the United States. The new bank was almost an exact carbon copy of the previous one. It was authorized to create money for the federal government and to regulate state banks. It influenced larger amounts of capital and was better organized across state lines than the old bank. Consequently, its policies had a greater impact on the creation and extinguishing of the nation's money supply. For the first time in our history, the effects began to ricochet across the entire country at once instead of being confined to geographical regions. The age of the boom-bust cycle had at last arrived in America. In 1820, public opinion began to swing back in favor of the sound money principles espoused by the Jeffersonian Republicans. But since the Republican Party had by then abandoned those principles, a new coalition was formed headed by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, called the Democrat Party. One of its primary platforms was the abolishment of the bank. After Jackson was elected in 1828, he began in full earnest to bring that about. The head of the bank was a formidable adversary by the name of Nicholas Biddle. Biddle not only possessed great personal abilities, but many members of Congress were indebted to him for business favors. Consequently, the bank had many political friends. As Jackson's first term of office neared its end, Biddle asked Congress for an early renewal of the bank's charter, hoping that Jackson would not risk controversy in a re-election year. The bill was easily passed, but Jackson accepted the challenge and vetoed the measure. Thus, a battle over the bank's future became the primary presidential campaign issue. Jackson was re-elected by a large margin, and one of his first acts was to remove federal deposits from the bank and place them into private regional banks. Biddle counterattacked by contracting credit and calling in loans. This was calculated to shrink the money supply and trigger a national panic depression, which it did. He publicly blamed the downer on Jackson's removal of deposits. The plan almost worked. Biddle's political allies succeeded in having Jackson officially censured in the Senate. However, when the truth about Biddle's strategy finally leaked out, it backfired against him. He was called before a special congressional investigative committee to explain his actions. The censure against Jackson was rescinded, and the nation's third central bank passed into oblivion. Chapter 18. Loaves and Fishes and Civil War. Attempts to stabilize the banking system by political measures, including regulation of fractional reserve ratios and establishing bank failure insurance funds. The failure of all such schemes, the resulting economic conditions that led up to the Civil War. As detailed in the previous chapter, by 1836 the hydra-headed monster had been slain and, true to the president's campaign promise, the nation had Jackson and no bank. In April of that year, the administration moved to consolidate its victory and pushed a series of monetary reforms through Congress. One of these required all banks to cease issuing paper notes under $5. The figure later was increased to $20, and its purpose was to compel the nation to return to the use of gold and silver coin for everyday use, leaving bank notes primarily for large commercial transactions. The White House also announced that, in the future, all federal land sales would require full payment in lawful money, which of course meant precious metal coins. It must be remembered, however, that even though the Bank of the United States was dead, banking was very much alive, and so were Jackson's enemies. Much to the disappointment of the hard money advocates, these measures were not sufficient to usher in the millennium. Not only were they inadequate by themselves, they were soon circumvented by the development of new banking techniques and eventually were dismantled completely by a fickle Congress. The prohibition against bank notes of small denomination deserves special notice. It was an excellent concept, but what the legislators failed to understand, or at least pretended not to understand, was that banks at this time were increasingly dealing with checkbook money, technically called demand deposits. As people gradually became accustomed to this new method of transferring funds, the importance of bank notes declined. Placing a limit on the issuance of bank notes without any restriction on the creation of demand deposits was an exercise in futility. In 1837, as the Bank of the United States slipped into history, the nation was at the tail end of an economic boom. Professor Rothberg tells us that this expansion and the accompanying inflation had been fueled by the central bank. Total money in circulation had risen by 84% in just 4 years. Then, as inevitable as the setting sun, that portion of the money supply, which had been created by fractional reserve banking, in other words, the part which was backed by nothing, began to contract. 16% of all the nation's money totally disappeared in just that first year. Again, men were put out of work, businesses went into bankruptcy, homes and savings were lost. Many banks folded also, but their operators walked away with the spoils. Only the depositors were left holding the empty bag. There were numerous proposals advanced regarding how to infuse stability into the banking system. But then as now, none of them dealt with the real problem, which was fractional reserve banking itself. As Grosclose observed, these proposals were each according to a particular theory of how to multiply loaves and fishes, or how to make candy wool. Since the proposals presented then are identical to the ones being offered today, and since each of them was actually tried, it would seem appropriate to inquire into the actual results of these experiments. Proposal to base money on bank assets. There were 4 schools of thought regarding the multiplication of loaves and fishes. The first of these was that the creation of money should be limited to a ratio of the bank's assets. This was the formula that was tried in the New England states. In Massachusetts, for example, the issuance of bank notes was limited to 2 times the amount of the bank's capital actually held in the vault. Furthermore, this could not be in the form of paper money, bonds, securities, or other debt instruments. It had to be strictly gold or silver coin. Also, the banks were limited in the number of small denomination bank notes they could issue, and in this, Massachusetts served as the model for Jackson's attempted reform at the federal level. By previous standards, and certainly by the standards that prevail today, this was an exceptionally conservative policy. In fact, even during the previous stress of the War of 1812, when banks were failing by the hundreds across the country, the Massachusetts banks, and most of the other New England banks as well, were able to maintain full payment in specie. With the passage of time, however, the limit on bank notes became less important because the banks now were using checkbook money instead. Their paper notes may have been limited to 200% of their capital, but there was no effective limit to the numbers they could ink into people's deposit books. So the fraction in fractional reserve banking began to shrink again. Consequently, the monetary contraction of 1837 was like a scythe over the crop, says Grosclose, and 32 Massachusetts banks collapsed between that year and 1844. The state attempted to patch the system by instituting a network of bank examiners and by increasing the liability of bank stockholders for the lost funds of their depositors. But the underlying problem was still ignored. A new crop of banks then sprang into existence, and a new wave of speculative mania swept through the economy. By 1862, even though the law still limited bank notes to 2 times capital, the banks had created $73,685,000 in total money, including checkbook money. This was supported by a base of only $9,595,000 of specie, a reserve of only 13%. Massachusetts had not solved the problem. Proposal to protect deposits with a safety fund. The second theory about how to have stable banking and allow the banks to create money out of nothing was to create a safety fund. This fund, supported by all the banks, would come to the aid of any member which needed an emergency loan to cover a sudden drain of its reserves. It was the forerunner of today's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and related agencies. The first safety fund was established in New York in 1829. The law required each bank to contribute annually 0.5% of its capital stock until the total reached 3%. The fund was first put to the test during the crisis of 1837 and was almost swamped. The only thing that saved it was that the state agreed to accept the worthless notes of all the defunct banks as payment for canal tolls. In other words, the taxpayers were compelled to make up the difference. When the fund was exhausted, the solvent banks were punished by being forced to pay for the deficits of the insolvent ones. Naturally, this impelled all banks to act more recklessly. Why not? The upside was that profits would be higher, for a time at least, and the downside was that if recklessness got them into trouble, the safety fund would bail them out. The result was that the system provided a penalty for prudence and an incentive for recklessness, a situation with perfect parallel to that which exists in the banking system today. Grosclose says, the conservatively managed institutions, lending upon the safer risks, upon which naturally the margins of profit were smaller, found the assessments burdensome, and were compelled to embark upon the more speculative business in order to carry the charges. Gradually, all banks sank into the quagmire, and in 1857, the Massachusetts Safety Fund was abandoned. Michigan's experience with a safety fund was perhaps more typical of the period. It was established in 1836 and was completely blown away the next year, during the Panic of 1837. Proposal to base money on securities. The third proposal for maintaining a stable monetary system while, at the same time, allowing the banks to operate fraudulently was to base the money supply on government securities. In other words, upon paper certificates of government debt. This was the scheme adopted in the 1850s by Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and other Midwestern states. It also set the precedent for the Federal Reserve System 60 years later. Grosclose continues, so rampant was the note issue mania that the notes came to be called by the appropriate name of Red Dog and Wildcat currency. The rising crop of banks created a fictitious demand and a rising market for securities to be used as capital stock, and a consequent stimulus to the creation of public debt by the issue of securities. This was followed by more bank notes being issued against the securities, demand increasing and the market rising, more securities issues, more bank notes, and so on in an endless chain of debt creation and inflation of paper wealth. The process was finally brought to a stop by the Panic of 1857. Proposal to back money with state credit. The fourth proposal for producing something out of nothing was to back the issuance of money by the full faith and credit of the state. This was the method tried by many of the southern states, and it, too, has survived to become one of the cornerstones of our modern-day banking system. Alabama, for example, in 1835 created a state bank funded by a public bond issue of $13,800,000. Instant money flooded through the economy, and people were joyous over the miracle prosperity. The legislators were so intoxicated with the scheme that they completely abolished direct taxation and decided to run the government on bank money instead. In other words, instead of raising state revenue through taxes, they found it easier to raise it through inflation. Like all the others, this bubble also burst in the Panic of 1837. A post-mortem examination of the bank showed that $6 million of its assets were completely worthless. The people who had loaned their real money to the venture, backed by the full faith and credit of the state, lost almost all of their investment, in addition to what they had paid through inflation. Mississippi put its full faith and credit behind a state bank in 1838 and issued $15 million in bonds as backing for its banknotes. The bank was belly up within 4 years, and the state completely repudiated its obligations on the bonds. This infuriated the bondholders, particularly the British financiers who had purchased a large portion of the issue. The devastating effect upon the state and its people is described by Henry Poor. The $48 million of the bank's loans were never paid. The $23 million of notes and deposits were never redeemed. The whole system fell, a huge and shapeless wreck, leaving the people of the state very much as they came into the world. Everybody was in debt, without any possible means of payment. Lands became worthless for the reason that no one had any money to pay for them. Such numbers of people fled from a state that the common return upon legal processes against debtors was in the very abbreviated form GT. Gone to Texas. Money based on the full faith and credit of the state met similar fates in Illinois, Kentucky, Florida, Tennessee, arid Louisiana. When the state bank collapsed in Illinois in 1825, all of the full faith bank notes left in its possession were ceremoniously burned at the public square. Another bank was formed in 1835 and collapsed in 1842. So devastating were these experiences that the Illinois Constitution of 1848 stipulated that, henceforth, the state should never again create a bank or own banking stock. In Arkansas, even real estate was tried as a magic wand. Subscribers to the state bank, instead of putting up cash, were allowed merely to pledge their real estate holdings as collateral. The bank notes rapidly plummeted in value to only 25% of their face amount, and within 4 years, the bank was gone. The mirage of free banking. There was a parallel development at this time called free banking. The name is an insult to truth. What was called free banking was merely the conversion of banks from corporations to private associations. Aside from no longer receiving a charter from a state, practically every other aspect of the system remained the same, including a multitude of government controls, regulations, supports, and other blocks against the free market. George Selgin reminds us that permission to set up a bank was usually accompanied by numerous restrictions, including especially required loans to the state. The free banks were no less fraudulent than the chartered banks. The old custom was revived of rushing gold coins from one bank to another just ahead of the bank examiners, and of putting a ballast of lead, broken glass, and appropriately, 10-penny nails in the box under a thinner covering of gold coins. 1. When one such free bank collapsed in Massachusetts, it was discovered that its bank note circulation of $500,000 was backed by exactly $86.48. Professor Hans Sennholz writes, although economists disagree on many things, most see eye to eye on their acceptance of political control. These economists invariably point at American money and banking before the Civil War, which, in their judgment, confirms their belief. In particular, they cite the free banking era of 1838 to 1860 as a frightening example of turbulent banking and, therefore, applaud the legislation that strengthened the role of government. In reality, the instability experienced during the free banking era was not caused by anything inherent in banking, but resulted from extensive political intervention. Free banking acts did not repeal burdensome statutory provisions and regulatory directives. In fact, they added a few. For banking to have been truly free, the states would have had to do only two things. One, enforce banking contracts the same as any other contract, and then, two, step out of the picture. By enforcing banking contracts, the executives of any bank which failed to redeem its currency in specie would have been sent to prison, an eventuality which soon would have put a halt to currency overissue. By stepping out of the picture and dropping the pretense of protecting the public with a barrage of rules, regulations, safety funds, and guarantees, people would have realized that it was their responsibility to be cautious and informed. But instead, the banks continued to enjoy the special privilege of suspending payment without punishment, and the politicians clamored to convince the voters that they were taking care of everything. In short, throughout this entire period of bank failures, economic chaos, and fleecing of both investors and taxpayers, America tried everything except full redemption by gold and silver. As the name of Andrew Jackson faded into history, so did the dream of honest banking. Not all banks were corrupt, and certainly not all bankers were conspirators against the public. There were many examples of honest men striving to act in an ethical manner in the discharge of their fiduciary responsibilities. But they were severely hampered by the system within which they labored, a system which, as previously illustrated, punished prudence and rewarded recklessness. In balance, the prudent banker was pushed aside by the mainstream and became but a footnote to the history of that period. Industrial expansion in spite of dishonest banking. Another positive aspect to the picture is that it was during this same time that many business enterprises came into being and greatly prospered, albeit at the expense of those who had no desire to contribute. The great canals were dug, the railroads pushed back the frontier, boom towns sprang up along the way, prairies were turned into agricultural land, and new businesses followed in their wake. Much of this expansion was facilitated by a flood of fraudulent money created by the banks. Apologists for fractional reserve banking have been prone to look at this development and conclude that, in net balance, it was a good thing. The fact that some people were cheated in order for others to prosper did not seem to be important. America just wouldn't have grown and prospered without funny money. Galbraith, for example, exudes, as civilization, or some approximation, came to an Indiana or Michigan crossroads in the 1830s or 1840s, so did a bank. Its notes, when used and loaned to a farmer to buy land, livestock, feed, seed, food, or simple equipment, put him in a business. If he and others prospered and paid off their loans, the bank survived. If he and others did not so prosper and pay, the bank failed, and someone, perhaps a local creditor, perhaps an Eastern supplier, was left holding the worthless notes. But some borrowers from this bank were by now in business. Somewhere, someone holding the notes had made an involuntary contribution to the winning of the West. The banking anarchy served the frontier far better than a more orderly system that kept a tight hand on credit could have done. William Grider continues this rationale. Reckless, booming anarchy, in short, produced fundamental progress. It was not a stable system, racked as it was with bank failures and collapsed business ventures, outrageous speculation and defaulted loans. It was also energetic and inventive, creating permanent economic growth that endured after the froth had blown away. This, of course, is a classic example of the failure of liberal economics. When evaluating a policy, it focuses only on one beneficial consequence for one group of people and ignores the multitude of harmful effects which befall all other groups. Yes, if we look only at the frontiersmen who acquired new ranches and established new business, the fractional reserve system looks pretty good. But if we add into the equation all the financial losses to all of the people who were victimized by the system, what Galbraith calls an involuntary contribution and what Grider lightly dismisses as froth, then the product is zero at best, and, in terms of morality, is deeply in the negative. Galbraith, Grider, and other popular economists assumed that the West could not possibly have been won with honest banking. Logic does not support such a conclusion. There is every reason to believe that the bank failures and the resulting business failures on the frontier all but canceled out the gains that were made by hard work and honest industry. Had these destructive convulsions been absent, as most of them would have been under a less chaotic system, there likely would have been fewer business starts, but a greater number would have finished, and it is entirely possible that the West would have been won even faster than it was. It's too bad the theory has never been tried. The Union in jeopardy. As chronicled in a previous section, economic conflict has always played a major role in fomenting war. There is no time in American history in which there was more economic conflict between segments of the population than there was prior to the Civil War. It is not surprising, therefore, that this period led directly into the nation's bloodiest war, made all the more tragic because it pitted brother against brother. There are many popular myths about the cause of the war between the states. Just as the Bolshevik Revolution is commonly believed to have been a spontaneous mass uprising against a tyrannical aristocracy, so, too, it is generally accepted that the Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. That, at best, is a half-truth. Slavery was an issue, but the primary force for war was a clash between the economic interests of the North and the South. Even the issue of slavery itself was based on economics. It may have been a moral issue in the North where prosperity was derived from the machines of heavy industry, but in the agrarian South, where fields had to be tended by vast workforces of human labor, the issue was primarily a matter of economics. The relative unimportance of slavery as a cause for war was made clear by Lincoln himself during his campaign for the presidency in 1860, and he repeated that message in his first inaugural address. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Even after the outbreak of war in 1861, Lincoln confirmed his previous stand. He declared, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." It may come as a surprise to learn that, by strict definition, Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist. In his fourth debate with Senator Stephen Douglas, he addressed the subject bluntly. "I am not nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." This is not to say that Lincoln was indifferent to the institution of slavery, for he felt strongly that it was a violation of personal and national morality, but he also knew that slavery was gradually being swept away all over the world, with the possible exception of Africa itself, and he believed that it would soon disappear in America simply by allowing the natural forces of enlightenment to work their way through the political system. He feared, and rightly so, that to demand immediate and total reform not only would destroy the Union, it would lead to massive bloodshed and more human suffering than was endured even under slavery itself. He said, "I have not allowed myself to forget that the abolition of the slave trade by Great Britain was agitated 100 years before it was a final success. that the measure had its open fire-eating opponents, its stealthy don't-care opponents, its dollar and cent opponents, its inferior race opponents, its Negro equality opponents, and its religion and good order opponents, that all these opponents got offices, and their adversaries got none. But I have also remembered that though they blazed like tallow candles for a century, at last they flickered in the socket, died out, stank in the dark for a brief season, and were remembered no more, even by the smell. Schoolboys know that Wilberforce and Granville Sharp helped that cause forward. But who can now name a single man who labored to retard it? Remembering these things I cannot, but regard it as possible that the higher object of this contest may not be completely attained within the term of my natural life. If Lincoln's primary goal in the war was not the abolition of slavery, but simply to preserve the Union, the question arises, why did the Union need preserving? Or, more pointedly, why did the Southern states want to secede? Legal plunder, not slavery, the cause of war. The South, being predominantly an agricultural region, had to import practically all of its manufactured goods from the northern states or from Europe, both of which reciprocated by providing a market for the South's cotton. However, many of the textiles and manufactured items were considerably cheaper from Europe, even after the cost of shipping had been added. The Southern states, therefore, often found it to their advantage to purchase these European goods rather than those made in the North. This put considerable competitive pressure on the American manufacturers to lower their prices and operate more efficiently. The Republicans were not satisfied with that arrangement. They decided to use the power of the federal government to tip the scales of competition in their favor. Claiming that this was in the national interest, they levied stiff import duties on almost every item coming from Europe that was also manufactured in the North. Not surprisingly, there was no duty applied to cotton which, presumably, was not a commodity in the national interest. One result was that European countries countered by stopping the purchase of U.S. cotton, which badly hurt the Southern economy. The other result was that manufacturers in the North were able to charge higher prices without fear of competition, and the South was forced to pay more for practically all of its necessities. It was a classic case of legalized plunder in which the law was used to enrich one group of citizens at the expense of another. Pressure from the North against slavery in the South made matters even more volatile. A fact often overlooked in this episode is that the cost of a slave was very high, around $1,500 each. A modest plantation with only 40 or 50 slaves, therefore, had a large capital investment, which, in terms of today's purchasing power, represented many millions of dollars. To the South, therefore, abolition meant not only the loss of its ability to produce a cash crop, but the total destruction of an enormous capital base. Many Southern plantation owners were working toward the day when they could convert their investment to more profitable industrial production, as had been done in the North, and others felt that freemen who were paid wages would be more efficient than slaves who had no incentive to work. For the present, however, they were stuck with the system they inherited. They felt that a complete and sudden abolition of slavery, with no transition period, would destroy their economy and leave many of the former slaves to starve, all of which actually happened in due course. That was the situation that existed at the time of Lincoln's campaign, and why. In his speeches, he attempted to calm the fears of the South about his intentions. But his words were mostly political rhetoric. Lincoln was a Republican, and he was totally dependent on the Northern industrialists who controlled the party. Even if he had wanted to, and there is no indication that he did, he could not have reversed the trend of economic favoritism and protectionism that swept him into office. Mexico and the Monroe Doctrine. In addition to the conflicting interests between North and South, there were other forces also working to split the nation in two. Those forces were rooted in Europe and centered around the desire of France, Spain, and England to control the markets of Latin America. Mexico was the prime target. This was the reason the Monroe Doctrine had been formulated 38 years previously. President James Monroe had put the European nations on notice that the United States would not interfere in their affairs, and that any interference by them in American affairs would not be tolerated. In particular, the proclamation said that the American continents were no longer to be considered as available for colonization. None of the European powers wanted to put this issue to the test, But they knew that if the United States were to become embroiled in a civil war, it could not also cross swords in Latin America. To encourage war between the states, therefore, was to pave the way for colonial expansion in Mexico. The Americas had become a giant chessboard for the game of global politics. In the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, we read, the war had not progressed very far before it was clear that the ruling classes in each of these two countries, England and France, sympathized strongly with the Confederacy, so strongly that with just a little prodding, they might be moved to intervene and bring about Southern independence by force of arms. Europe's aristocracies had never been happy about the prodigious success of one. See No Civil War at All, Part 1, by William Culhane, Journal of the Yankee Democracy. If the nation now broke into halves, proving that democracy did not contain the stuff of survival, the rulers of Europe would be well pleased. The global chess match between Lincoln on the one side and England and France on the other was closely watched by the other leaders of Europe. One of the most candid observers at that time was the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck. Since Bismarck was, himself, deeply obligated to the power of international finance, his observations are doubly revealing. He said, the division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained in one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over the Europe and the world. Of course, in the inner circle of finance, the voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. They saw an opportunity for prodigious booty if they could substitute two feeble democracies, burdened with debt to the financiers, in place of a vigorous republic sufficient unto herself. Therefore, they sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery and to drive a wedge between the two parts of the Union. The rupture between the North and the South became inevitable. The masters of European finance employed all their forces to bring it about and to turn it to their advantage. The strategy was simple but effective. Within months after the first clash of arms between North and South, France had landed troops in Mexico. By 1864, the Mexicans were subdued and the French monarch installed Ferdinand Maximilian as the puppet emperor. The Confederacy found a natural ally in Maximilian, and it was anticipated by both groups that, after the successful execution of the war, they would combine into a new nation, dominated by the financial power of Rothschild, of course. At the same time, England moved 11,000 troops into Canada, positioned them menacingly along the Union's northern flank, and placed the British fleet on a wartime alert. The European powers were closing in for a checkmate. Summary: the Second Bank of the United States was dead, but banking was very much alive. Many of the old problems continued, and new ones arrived. The issuance of banknotes had been severely limited, but that was largely offset by the increasing use of checkbook money, which had no limits at all on its issue. When the Bank of the U.S. slipped into history, the nation was nearing the end of the boom phase of a boom/bust cycle. When the inevitable contraction of the money supply came, politicians began to offer proposals on how to infuse stability into the banking system. None dealt with the real problem, which was fractional reserve banking itself. They concentrated instead on proposals on how to make it work. All of these proposals were tried, and they failed. These years are sometimes described as a period of free banking, which is an insult to truth. All that happened was that banks were converted from corporations to private associations, a change in form, not substance. They continued to be burdened by government controls, regulations, supports, and other blocks against the free market. The economic chaos and conflict of this period was a major cause of the Civil War. Lincoln made it clear during his public speeches that slavery was not the issue. The basic problem was the North and the South were dependent on each other for trade. The industrialized North sold its products to the South, which sold its cotton to the North. The South also had a similar trade with Europe, and that was an annoyance to the North. Europe was selling many products at lower prices, and the North was losing market share. Northern politicians passed protectionist legislation putting import duties on industrial products. This all but stopped the importation of European goods and forced the South to buy from the North at higher prices. Europe retaliated by curtailing the purchase of American cotton. That hurt the South even more. It was a classic case of legalized plunder, and the South wanted out. Meanwhile, there were powerful forces in Europe that wanted to see America embroiled in civil war. If she could be split into two hostile countries, there would be less obstacle to European expansion on the North American continent. France was eager to capture Mexico and graft it onto a new empire, which would include many of the southern states as well. England, on the other hand, had military forces poised along the Canadian border ready for action. Political agitators, funded and organized from Europe, were active on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. The issue of slavery was but a ploy. America had become the target in a ruthless game of world economics and politics. Chapter 19. Greenbacks and Other Crimes. The causes of the Civil War shown to be economic and political, not the issue of freedom versus slavery. The manner in which both sides used fiat money to finance the war, the important role played by foreign powers. In the previous chapter, we saw how the American continent had become a giant chessboard in a game of global politics. The European powers had been anxious to see the United States become embroiled in a civil war and eventually break into two smaller and weaker nations. That would pave the way for their further colonization of Latin America without fear of the Americans being able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And so it was that within a few months after the outbreak of war between North and South, France landed troops in Mexico and, by 1864, had installed Maximilian as her puppet monarch. Negotiations were begun immediately to bring Mexico into the war on the side of the Confederacy. England moved her troops to the Canadian border in a show of strength. America was facing what appeared to be a checkmate from the powers in Europe. Russia aligns with the North. It was a masterful move that possibly could have won the game had not an unexpected event tipped the scale against it. Tsar Alexander II, who, incidentally, had never allowed a central bank to be established in Russia, notified Lincoln that he stood ready to militarily align with the North. Although the Tsar had recently freed the serfs in his own country, his primary motivation for coming to the aid of the Union undoubtedly had little to do with emancipating the slaves in the South. England and France had been maneuvering to break up the Russian Empire by splitting off Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Crimea, and Georgia. Napoleon III of France proposed to Great Britain and Austria that the three nations immediately declare war on Russia to hasten this dismemberment. Knowing that war was being considered by his enemies, Tsar Alexander decided to play a chess game of his own. In September of 1863, he dispatched his Baltic fleet of war ships to Alexandria, Virginia, and his Asiatic fleet to San Francisco. The significance of this move was explained by Russian-born Karl Wrangel-Rokossowski. No treaty was signed between Russia and the United States, but their mutual interest and the threat of war to both unified these two nations at this critical moment. By dispatching his Baltic fleet to the North American harbors, the Tsar changed his position from a defensive to an offensive one. Paragraph 3 of the instructions given to Admiral Lasovsky by Admiral Crabb, at that time Russian Secretary of the Navy, dated July 14, 1863, ordered the Russian fleet, in case of war, to attack the enemy's commercial shipping and their colonies so as to cause them the greatest possible damage. The same instructions were given to Admiral Popov, commander of the Russian Asiatic Fleet. The presence of the Russian Navy helped the Union enforce a devastating naval blockade against the southern states, which denied them access to critical supplies from Europe. It was not that these ships single-handedly kept the French and English vessels at bay. Actually, there is no record of them even firing upon each other, but that is the point. The fact that neither France nor England at that time wanted to risk becoming involved in an open war with the United States, and Russia led them to be extremely cautious with overt military aid to the South. Throughout the entire conflict, they found it expedient to remain officially neutral. Without the inhibiting effect of the presence of the Russian fleet, the course of the war could have been significantly different. The beginning of the war did not go well for the North, and in the early years, the outcome was far from certain. Not only did the Union Army face repeated defeats on the battlefield, but enthusiasm from the people at home was badly sagging. As mentioned previously, at the outset, this was not a popular war based on humanitarian principle. It was a war of business interests. That presented two serious problems for the North. The first was how to get people to fight, and the second was how to get them to pay. Both problems were solved by the simple expediency of violating the Constitution. The Emancipation Proclamation. To get people to fight, it was decided to convert the war into an anti-slavery crusade. The Emancipation Proclamation was primarily a move on the part of Lincoln to fan the dying embers of support for the rich man's war and the poor man's fight, as it was commonly called in the North. Furthermore, it was not an amendment to the Constitution nor even an act of Congress. It was issued totally without constitutional authority as the solitary order of Lincoln himself, acting as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Preservation of the Union was not enough to fire men's enthusiasm for war. Only the higher issue of freedom could do that. To make the cause of freedom synonymous with the cause of the North, there was no alternative but to officially declare against slavery. After having emphasized over and over again that slavery was not the reason for war, Lincoln later explained why he changed his course and issued the proclamation. Things had gone from bad to worse until I felt we had reached the end of our rope on the plan we were pursuing, that we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game. I now determined upon the adoption of the emancipation policy. The rhetoric of the proclamation was superb, but the concept left a great deal to be desired. Bruce Catton, writing in the American Heritage Pictorial History of the Civil War, explains, technically, the proclamation was almost absurd. It proclaimed freedom for all slaves in precisely those areas where the United States could not make its authority effective and allowed slavery to continue in slave states which remained under federal control. But in the end, the creature from Jekyll Island, it changed the whole character of the war and, more than any other single thing, doomed the Confederacy to defeat. The proclamation had a profound impact on the European powers as well. As long as the war had been viewed as an attempt on the part of the government to put down rebellion, there was nothing sacred about it, and there was no stigma attached to helping either side. But now that freedom was the apparent issue, no government in Europe, least of all England and France, dared to anger its own subjects by taking sides against a country that was trying to destroy slavery. After 1862, the chance that Europe would militarily intervene on behalf of the Confederacy rapidly faded to zero. On the propaganda front, the South had been maneuvered into a position which could not be defended in the modern world. Converting the war into an anti-slavery crusade was a brilliant move on Lincoln's part, and it resulted in a surge of voluntary recruits into the Union Army. But this did not last. Northerners may have disapproved of slavery in the South, but once the bloodletting began in earnest, their willingness to die for that conviction began to wane. At the beginning of the war, enlistments were for only 3 months, and when that period was over, many of the soldiers declined to renew. Lincoln faced the embarrassing reality that he soon would have no army to carry on the crusade, raising armies on both sides. Historically, men are willing to take up arms to defend their families, their homes, and their country when threatened by a hostile foe. But the only way to get them to fight in a war in which they have no perceived personal interest is either to pay them large bonuses and bounties or to force them to do so by conscription. It is not surprising, therefore, that both methods were employed to keep the Union Army in the field. Furthermore, although the Constitution specifies that only Congress can declare war and raise an army, Lincoln did so entirely on his own authority. The northern states were given an opportunity to fill a specified quota with volunteers before conscription began. To meet these quotas and to avoid the draft, every state, township, and county developed an elaborate bounty system. By 1864, there were many areas where a man could receive more than $1,000, equivalent to over $50,000 today, just for joining the army. A person of wealth could avoid the draft simply by paying a commutation fee or by hiring someone else to serve in his place. In the South, the government was even more bold in its approach to conscription. Despite its cherished views on states' rights, the Confederacy immediately gathered into Richmond many of the powers and prerogatives of centralized national government. In 1862, it passed a conscription law which placed exclusive control over every male citizen between the ages of 18 and 35 into the hands of the Confederate president. As in the North, there were important loopholes. The owner or overseer of 20 slaves, for example, could not be called into military service. In all fairness, it must be noted that many did not take advantage of this exclusion. In contrast to the North, soldiers perceived that they were fighting for the defense of their families, homes, and property rather than for an abstract cause or for a cash bounty. Rebellion in the North. When conscription was initiated by Lincoln in 1863, people in the North were outraged. In New York's Madison Square, thousands of protesters marched in torch parades and attended anti-Lincoln rallies. Historian James Horan describes the mood. When caricatures of the president were lifted above the speaker's stand, hisses rose to fill the night with the noise of a million angry bees. Federal troops eventually had to be called in to put down anti-draft riots in Ohio and Illinois. In New York City, when the first names of the draft were published in the papers on July 12th, mobs stormed the draft offices and set fire to buildings. The riots continued for 4 days and were suppressed only when the Federal Army of the Potomac was ordered to fire into the crowds. Over 1,000 civilians were killed or wounded. After the passage of many years, it is easy to forget that Lincoln had an insurrection on his hands in the North as well as in the South. The shooting of 1,000 civilians by soldiers of their own government is a tragedy of mammoth proportions, and it tells much about the desperate state of the Union at that time. To control that insurrection, Lincoln ignored the Constitution once again by suspending the right of habeas corpus, which made it possible for the government to imprison its critics without formal charges and without trial. Thus, under the banner of opposing slavery, American citizens in the North not only were killed on the streets of their own cities, they were put into military combat against their will and thrown into prison without due process of law. In other words, free men were enslaved so that slaves could be made free. Even if the pretended crusade had been genuine, it was a bad exchange. How to get people to pay for the war was handled in a similar fashion. If the Constitution could be pushed aside on the issue of personal rights and of war itself, it certainly would not stand in the way of mere funding. It has often been said that truth is the first casualty in war, to which we should add, money is the second. During the fiscal year ending in 1861, expenses of the federal government had been $67 million. After the first year of armed conflict, they were $475 million, and by 1865 had risen to $1,300 million. On the income side of the ledger, taxes covered only about 11% of that figure. By the end of the war, the deficit had risen to $2.61 billion. That money had to come from somewhere. Income taxes and war bonds. The nation's first experiment with the income tax was tried at this time, another violation of the Constitution. By today's standards, it was a small bite, but it was still an extremely unpopular measure, and Congress knew that any additional taxes would further fan the flames of rebellion. Previously, the traditional source of funding in time of war had been the banks, which simply created money under the pretense of loaning it. But that method had been severely hampered by the demise of the Bank of the United States. The state banks were anxious to step into that role, but by this time, most of them had already defaulted in their promise to pay in specie and were in no position to manufacture further money, at least not money which the public would be willing to accept. American banks may have been unable to supply adequate loans, but the Rothschild Consortium in Britain was both able and willing. It was during this time that the Rothschilds were consolidating their new industrial holdings in the United States through their agent, August Belmont. Derek Wilson tells us, they owned or had major shareholdings in Central American ironworks, North American canal construction companies, and a multiplicity of other concerns. They became the major importers of bullion from the newly discovered goldfields. Belmont had placed large amounts of Rothschild money into the bonds of state-sponsored banks in the South. Those bonds, of course, had fallen in value to practically zero. As the war shifted in favor of the North, however, he began to buy up as many additional bonds as he could, paying but a few pennies on each dollar of face value. It was his plan to have the Union force the Southern states at the end of the war to honor all of their pre-war debt obligations in full. That, of course, would have been a source of gigantic speculative profits to the Rothschilds. Meanwhile, on the northern side of the Mason-Dixon line, Belmont became the chief agent for the sale of Union bonds in England and France. It was rumored that when Belmont called on President Lincoln and personally offered Rothschild money at 27.5% interest, he was rudely thrown out of the office. The story is doubtful, but it represents a larger truth. Profiting from war and placing money on both sides of the conflict were exactly the kind of maneuvers for which the Rothschilds had become famous throughout Europe and were now practicing in America. In the North, the sale of government bonds was the one measure for raising funds that seemed to work. Even that, however, with the lure of compounded interest to be paid in gold at a future date, failed to raise more than about half the needed amount. So the Union faced a real dilemma. The only options remaining were 1. Terminate the war, or 2. Print fiat money. For Lincoln and the Republicans who controlled Congress, the choice was never seriously in doubt. The precedent had already been set during the War of 1812. At that time, Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, had abrogated the constitutional ban against bills of credit by printing Treasury notes, most of which paid interest at 5.4%. The money was never declared legal tender, and that probably was the basis on which it was defended as constitutional. The Greenbacks. By the time of the war between the states, however, all pretense at constitutionality had been dropped. In 1862, Congress authorized the Treasury to print $150 million worth of bills of credit and put them into circulation as money to pay for its expenses. They were declared as legal tender for all private debts, but could not be used for government duties or taxes. The notes were printed with green ink and, thus, became immortalized as greenbacks. Voters were assured that this was a one-time emergency measure, a promise that was soon broken. By the end of the war, a total of $432 million in greenbacks had been issued. The pragmatic mood in Washington was that a constitution is nice to have in times of peace, but an unaffordable luxury in war. Salmon P. Chase, for example, as Secretary of the Treasury, strongly endorsed the greenbacks which were issued under his direction. They were, in his words, an indispensable necessity. 8 years later, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he declared that they were unconstitutional. Had he changed his mind? Not at all. When he endorsed them, the nation was at war. When he declared them unconstitutional, it was at peace. It was merely another example of the universal trait of all governments in time of war. That trait was presented in a previous section as the premise of the Rothschild formula. The sanctity of its laws, the prosperity of its citizens, and the solvency of its treasury will be quickly sacrificed by any government in its primal act of self-survival. The pressure for issuance of greenbacks originated in Congress, but Lincoln was an enthusiastic supporter. His view was that government, possessing power to create and issue currency and credit as money and enjoying the right to withdraw currency and credit from circulation by taxation and otherwise, need not and should not borrow capital at interest. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of the government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. It would appear that Lincoln objected to having the government pay interest to the banks for money they create out of nothing when the government can create money out of nothing just as easily and not pay interest on it. If one ignores the fact that both of these schemes are forbidden by the Constitution and is willing to tolerate the plunder by inflation that is the consequence of both, then there's an appealing logic to the argument. The politicians continue to have their fiat money, but at least the banks are denied a free ride. Lincoln's mixed view of banking. It is apparent that Lincoln had undergone a change of heart regarding banks. Early in his political career, he had been a friend of the banking industry and an advocate of easy credit. As a member of the Whig political party in the 1830s, before becoming a Republican in his campaign for the presidency, he had been a supporter of Biddle's Second Bank of the United States. During his famous debates with Senator Stephen Douglas, one of the points of contention between the two was that Lincoln defended the bank and advocated its reestablishment. Furthermore, after becoming president, he took the initiative in requesting Congress to reestablish central banking. Lincoln appears to have been inconsistent, and one gets a gnawing feeling that, in his effort to finance an unpopular war, he sometimes found it necessary, like Salmon Chase and other politicians of the time, to anesthetize his personal convictions and do whatever was required to meet the exigencies of governmental survival. One thing, however, is clear. Regardless of Lincoln's personal views on money, the Greenbacks were not pleasing to the bankers who were thereby denied their customary override on government debt. They were anxious to have this federal fiat money replaced by bank fiat money. For that to be possible, it would be necessary to create a whole new monetary system with government bonds used as backing for the issuance of banknotes. In other words, the return to central banking. And that was precisely what Secretary Chase was preparing to establish. In 1862, the basic position of the bankers was outlined in a memo called the Hazard Circular, prepared by an American agent of British financiers and circulated among the country's wealthy businessmen. It said, "The great debt that capitalists will see to it is made out of the war must be used as a means to control the volume of money. To accomplish this, the bonds must be used as a banking basis. We are now waiting for the Secretary of the Treasury to make this recommendation to Congress. It will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that. But we can control the bonds and through them the bank issues." The National Banking Act. On February 25, 1863, Congress passed the National Banking Act, with major amendments the following year, which established a new system of nationally chartered banks. The structure was similar to the Bank of the United States, with the exception that instead of one central bank with power to influence the activities of the others, there were now to be many national banks with control over all of them, coming from Washington. Most banking legislation is sold to the public under the attractive label of reform. The National Banking Act was one of the rare exceptions. It was promoted fairly honestly as a wartime emergency scheme to raise money for military expenses by creating a market for government bonds and then transforming those bonds into circulating money. Here is how it worked. When a national bank purchased government bonds, it did not hold on to them. It turned them back to the Treasury, which exchanged them for an equal amount of United States banknotes, with the bank's name engraved on them. The government declared these to be legal tender for taxes and duties, and that status caused them to be generally accepted by the public as money. The bank's net cost for these bonds was zero because they got their money back immediately. Technically, the bank still owned the bonds and collected interest on them, but they also had the use of an equal amount of newly created banknote money, which also could be loaned out at interest. When all the smoke and mirrors were moved away, it was merely a variation on the ancient scheme. The monetary and political scientists had simply converted government debt into money, and the bankers were collecting a substantial fee at both ends for their service. The one shortcoming of the system, at least from the point of view of the manipulators, was that even though the bank notes were widely circulated, they were not classified as lawful money. In other words, they were not legal tender for all debts, just for taxes and duties. Precious metal coins and greenbacks were still the country's official money. It was not until the arrival of the Federal Reserve System 50 years later that government debt in the form of banknotes would be mandated as the nation's official money for all transactions, under penalty of law. The National Banking Act of 1863 required banks to keep a percentage of their notes and deposits in the form of lawful money, gold coins, as a reserve to cover the possibility of a run. That percentage varied depending on the size and location of the bank, but on an average, it was about 12%. That means a bank with $1 million in coin deposits could use approximately $880,000 of that, $1 million less 12%, to purchase government bonds, exchange the bond for banknotes, lend out the banknotes, and collect interest on both the bonds and the loans. The bank could now earn interest on $880,000 loaned to the government in the form of coins, plus interest on $880,000 loaned to its customers in the form of banknotes. That doubled the bank's income without the inconvenience of having to increase its capital. Needless to say, the bonds were gobbled up just as fast as they could be printed, and the problem of funding the war had been solved. Another consequence of the national banking system was to make it impossible from that date forward for the federal government ever to get out of debt. Please reread that statement. It is not an exaggeration. Even friends of central banking are forced to admit this reality. Galbraith says gloomily, "Rarely has economic circumstance managed successfully to confound the most prudent in economic foresight." In numerous years following the war, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not pay off its debt, retire its securities, because to do so meant there would be no bonds to back the national banknotes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply. As pointed out in a previous section, that is essentially the situation which exists today. Every dollar of our currency and checkbook money was created by the act of lending. If all debt were repaid, our entire money supply would vanish back into the inkwells and computers. The national debt is the principal foundation upon which money is created for private debt. To pay off or even greatly reduce the national debt would cripple our monetary system. No politician would dare to advocate that, even if surplus funds were available in the Treasury. The Federal Reserve System, therefore, has virtually locked our nation into perpetual debt. The hidden cost of war. The third consequence of the National Banking Act will come as no surprise to anyone who has survived the previous pages of this book. During the war, the purchasing power of the Greenbacks fell by 65%. The money supply increased by 138%. Prices more than doubled, while wages rose by less than half. By that mechanism, Americans surrendered to the government and to the banks more than half of all the money they earned or held during that period, in addition to their taxes. Financial conditions in the South were even worse. With the exception of the seizure of about $400,000 in gold from the Federal Mint at New Orleans, almost all of the war was funded by the printing of fiat money. Confederate notes increased in volume by 214% per year, while the volume of all money, including banknotes and checkbook money, rose by over 300% per year. In addition to the Confederate notes, each of the Southern states issued its own fiat money, and by the end of the war, the total of all notes was about $1 billion. Within the 4-year period, prices shot up by 9,100%. After Appomattox, of course, Confederate notes and bonds alike were totally worthless. As usual, the average citizen did not understand that the newly created money represented a hidden tax, which he would soon have to pay in the form of higher prices. Voters in the northern states certainly would not have tolerated an open and honest tax increase of that magnitude. Even in the South, where the cause was perceived as one of self-defense, it is possible that they would not have done so had they known in advance the true dimension of the assessment. But especially in the North, because they did not understand the secret science of money, Americans not only paid the hidden tax, but applauded Congress for creating it. On June 25, 1863, exactly 4 months after the National Bank Act was signed into law, a confidential communique was sent from the Rothschild Investment House in London to an associate banking firm in New York. It contained an amazingly frank and boastful summary. The few who understand the system, bank loans earning interest and also serving as money, will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent upon its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while, on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending, will bear its burdens without complaint. Lincoln's concern for the future. Lincoln was privately apprehensive about the Bank Act, but loyalty to his party and the need to maintain unity in time of war compelled him to withhold his veto. His personal view, however, was unequivocal. In a letter to William Elkins the following year, he said, "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong." In reviewing Lincoln's role throughout this painful chapter of history, it is impossible not to feel ambivalence. On the one hand, he declared war without Congress, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, not as an administrative executive carrying out the wishes of Congress, but as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Furthermore, the proclamation was not issued out of humanitarian motives, as popular history portrays, but as a maneuver to generate popular support for the war. By participating in the issuance of the Greenbacks, he violated one of the most clearly written and important sections of the Constitution. And by failing to veto the National Bank Act, he acquiesced in the delivery of the American people back into the hands of the international cabal, an act which was similar in many ways to the forcible return of captured runaway slaves. On the positive side, there is no question of Lincoln's patriotism. His concern was in preserving the Union, not the Constitution, and his refusal to let the European powers split America into a cluster of warring nation-states was certainly wise. Lincoln believed that he had to violate part of the Constitution in order to save the whole. But that is dangerous reasoning. It can be used in almost any national crisis as the excuse for the expansion of totalitarian power. There is no reason to believe that the only way to save the Union was to scrap the Constitution. In fact, if the Constitution had been meticulously observed from the very beginning, the Southern minority could never have been legally plundered by the Northern majority, and there likely would have been no movement for secession in the first place. And even if there had been, a strict reading of the Constitution at that point could have led the way to an honorable and peaceful settlement of differences. The result would have been not only the preservation of the Union without war, but Americans would be enjoying far less government intervention in their daily lives today. With malice toward none. There is one point that is clearly on Lincoln's side. While his political compatriots were howling for economic vengeance against the South, the president stood firmly against it. With malice toward none was more than a slogan with him, and he was willing to risk his political survival on that one issue. The reason he had vetoed the Wade-Davis Emancipation Bill was because it would have applied a lien against Southern cotton at the end of the war to the benefit of New England textile manufacturers. The cotton also would have been taken as security to pay off Southern debt, which had been contracted before the war, thus providing the funds to buy back at face value all of the bonds which had been purchased at discount by Rothschild's agent, August Belmont. Such defiance of the financiers and speculators undoubtedly required great courage. But the issue ran deeper than that. Lincoln had offered a general amnesty to any citizen in the South who would agree to take a loyalty oath to the Union. When 10% of the voters had taken such an oath, he proposed that they could then elect congressmen, senators, and a state government which would be recognized as part of the Union once again. The Republicans, on the other hand, had incorporated into the Wade-Davis bill the provision that each seceded state was to be treated like a conquered country. Political representation was to be denied until 51%, not 10%, had taken an oath. Former slaves were given the right to vote, although women had not yet gained that right even in the North. But because of their lack of education and political awareness, no one expected them to play a meaningful role in government for many years to come. Furthermore, those taking the oath had to swear that they had never taken up arms against the Union. Since almost every able-bodied white male had done so, the effect would have been to deny the South political representation for at least 2 generations. Under Lincoln's amnesty policy, it would not be long before the Republicans would be overwhelmed in Congress by a large majority of Democrats. The Democrats in the North were already gaining strength on their own, and once they could be joined by the solid bloc of Democrats from the reunited South, the Republicans' political and economic power would be lost. So, when Lincoln vetoed the bill, his own party bitterly turned against him. Running throughout these cross-currents of motives and special interests were two groups which found it increasingly to their advantage to have Lincoln out of the way. One group consisted of the financiers, Northern industrialists, and radical Republicans, all of whom wanted to legally plunder the South at the end of the war. The politicians within that group also looked forward to further consolidating their power and literally establishing a military dictatorship. The other group was smaller in size, but equally dangerous. It consisted of hothead Confederate sympathizers from both South and North who sought revenge. Later events revealed that both of these groups had been involved in a conspiratorial liaison with an organization called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Knights of the Golden Circle. The Order of the Knights of the Golden Circle was a secret organization dedicated to revolution and conquest. Two of its better-known members were Jesse James and John Wilkes Booth. FT was organized by George W.L. Bickley, who established its first castle in Cincinnati in 1854, drawing membership primarily from Masonic lodges. It had close ties with a secret society in France called the Seasons, which itself was a branch of the Illuminati. After the beginning of the war, Bickley was made head of the Confederacy's Secret Service, and his organization quickly spread throughout the border and southern states as well. In the North, the conspirators were seeking to seize political power and overthrow the Lincoln government. In fact, the Northern anti-draft riots mentioned previously were largely the result of the planning and leadership of this group. In the South, they tried to promote the extension of slavery by the conquest of Mexico. In partnership with Maximilian, the Knights hoped to establish a Mexican-American empire, which would be an effective counterforce against the North. In fact, the very name of the organization is based on their goal of carving an empire out of North America with geographical boundaries forming a circle with the center in Cuba and its circumference reaching northward to Pennsylvania, southward to Panama. In 1863, the group was reorganized as the Order of American Knights and, again the following year, as the Order of the Sons of Liberty. Its membership then was estimated at between 200,000 and 300,000. After the war, it went further underground and remnants eventually emerged as the Ku Klux Klan. John Wilkes Booth. One of the persistent legends of this period is that John Wilkes Booth was not killed in Garrett's barn, as generally accepted, but was allowed to escape, that the corpse actually was that of an accomplice, and that the government, under the firm control of War Secretary Edwin M. Stanton, moved heaven and earth to cover up the facts. On the face of it, that is an absurd story. But when the voluminous files of the War Department were finally declassified and put into the public domain in the mid-1930s, historians were shocked to discover that there are many facts in those files which lend credence to the legend. The first to probe these amazing records was Otto Eisenschimmel, whose Why Was Lincoln Murdered? Was published by Little, Brown and Company in 1937. The best and most readable compilation of the facts, however, was written 20 years later by Theodore Roscoe. In the preface to this work, he states the startling conclusions which emerge from those long-hidden files. Of the immense 19th century literature that exists on Lincoln's assassination, much of the writing treats the tragedy at Ford's Theater as though it were grand opera. Only a few have seen the crime as a murder case. Lincoln dying by crass felony, Booth a stalking gunman leading a gang of primed henchmen, the murder plot containing ingredients as base as the profit motive. 70 years after the crime, writers were garbling it with a dignity it did not deserve. Lincoln, the stereotyped martyr, Booth, the stereotyped villain, the assassination avenged by classic justice, conspiracy strangled, virtue in the robes of government, emerging triumphant, and Lincoln belonging to the ages. But the facts of the case are neither so satisfying nor so gratifying. For the facts indicate that the criminals responsible for Lincoln's death got away with murder. Isola Forrester was the granddaughter of John Wilkes Booth. In her book entitled This One Mad Act, she tells of discovering the secret records of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which had been carefully wrapped and placed in a government vault many decades ago and designated as classified documents by Secretary Stanton. Since the assassination of Lincoln, no one had ever been allowed to examine that package. Because of her lineage to Booth, and because of her credentials as a professional writer, she was eventually permitted to become the first person in all those years to examine its contents. Forrester recounts the experience. It was 5 years before I was able to examine the contents of the mysterious old package hidden away in the safe of the room, which contained the relics and exhibits used in the conspiracy trial. Would never have seen them had I not knelt on the floor of the cell 5 years ago and seen into the back of the old safe where the package lay. It is all part of the odd mystery thrown about the case by the officials of the war period, the concealment of these documents and articles, and the hiding away of the 2 flakes of bone with the bullet and pistol. What mind ever grouped together such apparently incongruous and macabre exhibits? Here at last was a link with my grandfather. I knew that he had been a member of the secret order founded by Bickley, the Knights of the Golden Circle. I have an old photograph of him taken in a group of the Brotherhood, in full uniform, one that Harry's daughter had discovered for me in our grandmother's Bible. I knew that the newspapers, directly following the assassination, had denounced the order as having instigated the killing of Lincoln and had proclaimed Booth to have been its member and tool. And I was reminded again of those words I had heard from my grandmother's lips, that her husband had been the tool of other men. An interesting comment. One is compelled to wonder, the tool of what other men? Was Forrester's grandmother referring to the leaders of the Knights of the Golden Circle? To agents of European financiers? Or was it to conspirators within Lincoln's own party? We shall probably never know with certainty the extent to which any of these groups may have been involved in Lincoln's assassination, but we do know that there were powerful forces within the federal government, centered around Secretary of War Stanton, which actively concealed evidence and hastily terminated the investigation. Someone was protected. Summary. It is time now to leave this tragic episode and move along. So let us summarize. America's bloodiest and most devastating war was fought, not over the issue of freedom versus slavery, but because of clashing economic interests. At the heart of this conflict were questions of legalized plunder, banking monopolies, and even European territorial expansion into Latin America. The boot print of the Rothschild formula is unmistakable across the graves of American soldiers on both sides. In the North, neither greenbacks, taxes, nor war bonds were enough to finance the war. So a national banking system was created to convert government bonds into fiat money, and the people lost over half of their monetary assets to the hidden tax of inflation. In the South, printing presses accomplished the same effect, and the monetary loss was total. The issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln and the naval assistance offered by Tsar Alexander, too, were largely responsible for keeping England and France from intervening in the war on the side of the Confederacy. Lincoln was assassinated by a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society with rumored ties to American politicians and British financiers. Tsar Alexander was assassinated a few years later by a member of the People's Will, a nihilist secret society in Russia with rumored ties to financiers in New York City, specifically Jacob Schiff and the firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. As for the creature of central banking, there had been some victories and some defeats. The Greenbacks had for a while deprived the bankers of their override on a small portion of government debt, but the National Banking Act quickly put a stop to that. Furthermore, by using government bonds as backing for the money supply, it locked the nation into perpetual debt. The foundation was firmly in place, but the ultimate structure still needed to be erected. The monetary system was yet to be concentrated into one central bank mechanism, and the control was yet to be taken away from the politicians and placed into the hands of the bankers themselves. It was time for the creature to visit Congress. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the channel by hitting the subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon to receive new content notifications.